She walked out of divorce court with $11, a 6-year-old daughter, and nowhere left to go. Then her car got towed from the parking lot, the last thing she had left from that marriage, right in front of her eyes. But that wasn't even the worst thing that happened that day, because the man who stepped off that $1 million helicopter, the man she'd never met, the man she never wanted to meet, was about to change everything. Not with his money, not with his power, but with a choice that neither of them was ready to make. If you're watching this, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Nora Whitmore walked out of Fulton County Divorce Court with $11 in her purse, a 6-year-old girl on her hip, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a person when everything they built gets reduced to a stack of legal documents and a final signature. She didn't cry. She'd made herself a promise about that weeks ago, standing in the bathroom at 3 in the morning while Emma slept down the hall, and she intended to keep it. The August heat hit her the moment she pushed through the glass doors. Phoenix in August was its own kind of punishment, the kind that didn't apologize and didn't let up. The asphalt shimmered. The sky was the color of old bone. She shifted Emma's weight on her hip and walked toward the parking structure where her 2009 Civic was supposed to be waiting. It wasn't waiting. The tow truck was just pulling away when she rounded the corner, her car hooked to its hitch at a 45-degree angle, the bumper she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years catching the light in a way that felt almost theatrical. She stood there and watched it go. Emma watched it too, head resting against her mother's shoulder, thumb moving toward her mouth before Nora gently caught her hand. "Mama?" "It's okay," Nora said. "We're going to take the bus." She said it like they did this every day. She said it like the bus stop wasn't 6 blocks away in 107-degree heat. She said it the way she'd learned to say a lot of things. Steady, low, so Emma wouldn't feel the floor dropping out beneath them. If you've ever been completely alone in a crowd, if you've ever held yourself together by nothing but sheer will while the world kept moving around you like you were already gone, then stay with me. Because this is a story about what happens when the bottom falls out and the only thing left is the kind of strength nobody notices until they absolutely need it. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that parking lot because it's about to get a whole lot worse before it gets anywhere close to better. She had 6 blocks to walk and no shade to walk them in. Emma had her yellow backpack with the broken zipper, the one Nora had been meaning to replace since spring, and inside it were her coloring books and the stuffed rabbit named Gerald that went everywhere with her. Nora had her manila folder of court documents and $22. No, 11. The other 11 had gone to the parking structure she'd just been ejected from. She'd remembered the wrong total, and the math hit her somewhere behind the sternum like a dull punch. $11. No car. No house. That had been Trevor's, technically. Always Trevor's. Everything had always been technically Trevor's. She had her job at Rosalind's Diner, she had the motel off Highway 51 she'd prepaid through the end of the week, and she had Emma, and Emma was the only number that mattered. She adjusted her grip on the folder and started walking. The helicopter came out of nowhere. That wasn't quite true. She heard it before she saw it. A deep mechanical throb that built from nothing into something that shook the fillings in her teeth. And she looked up, expecting to see it passing overhead, just another piece of the city's indifferent sky. It wasn't passing overhead. It was descending. The vacant lot adjacent to the courthouse had apparently been cleared enough to function as an impromptu landing pad because the sleek black helicopter dropped toward it with the kind of casual arrogance that only belongs to people who've never had to ask permission for anything. It was enormous and expensive and utterly indifferent to the fact that Nora Whitmore was standing 10 feet from the chain-link fence with a 6-year-old and a manila folder full of the ruins of her marriage. The rotor wash hit her like a wall. Papers exploded out of the folder. She hadn't been holding it tight enough. She'd been holding Emma, and suddenly the air was full of her divorce decree, her custody agreement, the asset disclosure she'd cried over for 2 weeks, her attorney's billing summary, all of it spiraling up and outward in a white confetti disaster. "No, no, no!" She set Emma down and grabbed for the nearest sheet, catching it against her shin. She spun and grabbed another. Her hair had come loose from its clip and was lashing across her face. Emma shrieked with something between delight and terror at the sudden chaos, and took 3 steps toward the fence where the helicopter was settling onto the gravel. Nora didn't see her go. She was 4 feet away, chasing the custody agreement, when she turned back and Emma was no longer where she'd been. She was at the fence. She had her small fingers in the chain link. She was watching the rotors with wide, dark eyes and her mouth slightly open, and the helicopter's engine was still running. What happened next happened in a space that had no time in it. Nora moved. She wasn't aware of deciding to move. She crossed the distance between them and pulled Emma back and against her body in one motion, spinning so her own back was to the fence. And she held her so tight, Emma made a small surprise sound. Her heart was somewhere in her throat. She stood there with her eyes closed for 3 full seconds, feeling her daughter's ribs expand and contract against her forearms. "Mama, you're squishing me." "I know." She didn't let go. "The helicopter is very loud." "I know." She finally loosened her arms enough to turn around. The rotors were slowing. The side door of the helicopter was opening. She took Emma by the hand and began collecting what was left of her papers from the gravel and the scrubby grass along the fence, and she didn't look at the people climbing out because none of them were her concern. Her concern was the asset disclosure, which had landed in a puddle. Where the puddle had come from in this heat she could not explain, and was now curling at the edges. She picked it up anyway. She blotted it against her skirt. "She all right?" She looked up. The man standing at the fence was somewhere in his late 30s. Dark hair pushed back from his forehead the way men wear it when they're not thinking about how they look, which meant he always looked like that without trying. White dress shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. No jacket despite the heat. He was holding her custody agreement in one hand and looking at Emma with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not the usual uncomfortable performance of concern that people put on around children. Just direct attention, like he was actually asking. "She's fine," Nora said. She reached through the fence links and took the document from him. "Thank you." He didn't move. She was about 3 feet from the rotor path. "I know where she was." He studied her for a moment. Whatever he was looking for, she didn't offer it to him. She turned back to Emma and crouched down to check her knees, her hands, the small, serious face. "You scared me," she said quietly. Emma nodded. "The helicopter was really loud." "That's not an explanation, baby." "Okay." Emma considered. "I wanted to see the blades up close." "No more blades up close." She stood, took Emma's hand, and turned to find the man still standing there. Behind him, 2 other men in suits were helping an older gentleman down from the helicopter door, slowly, the way you help someone who isn't sure of their footing. The older man was moving carefully, one hand braced on the doorframe, and there was something wrong with the color of his face. "Excuse me," she said, moving past. She needed to find the rest of her papers. She'd gotten about 15 steps when she heard the sound, a sharp intake of breath from multiple people at once, followed by the clatter of something hitting the gravel. She turned. The old man had gone down. Not a stumble, not a slow sink. He just stopped, and then he wasn't standing anymore. And the 2 suited men were already backing away in that useless, panicked way that people back away when they don't know what to do and don't want to admit it. One of them had his phone out. The other was literally wringing his hands. The man from the fence was crouched over the old man, one hand on his shoulder, saying his name. "Samuel," he was saying. "Samuel," in a tight voice that was very close to fear. Nora handed Emma her folder. "Hold this flat," she said. "Both hands. Don't let it touch the ground." Emma took it with both hands. She knew her mother's serious voice. Nora walked back to the fence. The gate was about 20 feet to the left. She went through it and crossed to where the old man was on the ground and crouched down across from the man who'd given her back her papers. "How old is he?" The man looked up. 74. "Has he eaten today?" I don't know." "Has he been in the heat long?" "The flight was almost 2 hours. The cabin's climate controlled, but did he drink anything on the flight?" A pause. "I don't know." She was already checking his pulse, one hand under his jaw. It was there, rapid, weak. His skin felt like paper left in the sun. She looked at his face and saw what she'd seen from a distance. That gray underneath the tan color that wasn't sunburn was something more serious. "He needs water and he needs to get out of the heat right now," she said. "Not in a minute. Right now." "We have—" The man in the suit with the phone started. "Then go get it," she said, and the authority in her voice surprised even her. He went. She looked at the old man. His eyes were open, moving, not lost, just overwhelmed. She'd seen this before. It had happened to a regular at the diner 2 summers ago, a retired postal worker named Chester who came in every Tuesday for the chicken soup, and she'd kept him conscious and upright until the ambulance arrived by talking to him and keeping his attention. "Sir," she put her hand flat on his sternum. "Can you hear me?" He focused on her face. "Yes," he said. It came out thin. "Good. You're okay. You're going to be okay. You've got some heat in you, and we need to get it out. My name's Nora. What's yours?" "Samuel." A pause. "Samuel Mercer." "Hello, Samuel. Stay with me. Tell me, do you have any heart conditions? Any medications I should know about?" "Blood pressure." He said the name of the medication. She knew it. It was common. It also made dehydration worse. The suited man came back with a cold bottle of water. She took it. She looked at the man crouched across from her. "We need to get him into shade. Is there any shade on this side of the building?" He stood up and looked. He moved fast for someone his size. "There's an overhang, 15 feet. "Okay, we're going to move him there. Carefully. I need you to support his left side. Can you do that?" He looked at her for half a second in a way she couldn't fully read. "Yes." They moved Samuel Mercer slowly, carefully, the way you move someone who doesn't need an ambulance but needs to believe they don't. She kept her hand on his arm and kept talking. Just steady, low words, nothing important, the kind of voice you use to walk someone back from the edge of panic. By the time they got him settled in the shade with his back against the building and the water open in his hands, the color was already beginning to come back to his face. "Small sips," she said. "Don't rush it." "You're very bossy," Samuel said. "I've heard that." She sat back on her heels. "How do you feel?" "Embarrassed." "That means you're better. Drink more water." Behind her, she was aware that Emma had followed and was standing a few feet back, still holding the folder with both hands, watching with the particular focused solemnity that children bring to situations they sense are serious. Nora glanced back at her. Emma held up the folder slightly, showing she hadn't let it drop. Nora nodded once. She turned back to find the other man watching her. He wasn't being subtle about it. He stood with his arms crossed loosely and his eyes on her with an expression she still couldn't quite name. Not the way people look at you when they want something, not the performance of being impressed, more like someone revising a calculation mid-problem. "You've done that before," he said. "Done what?" "That." He nodded toward Samuel. You knew what to do. You didn't wait." "I've been a waitress for 10 years, she said, standing up and brushing the gravel dust from her knees. "You see, a lot of things happen to a lot of people. You learn to read the room." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Adrian Vale." He held out his hand. She looked at it and then at him. "I know who you are," she said. She didn't take the hand. A beat. "Okay. Thank you for your help with Samuel. He needs to rest somewhere cool for at least an hour before he does anything else. Make sure he eats." She turned. "Emma, let's go." Emma fell into step beside her, still holding the folder. They were halfway to the gate when she heard his voice behind her. "Ms. A pause. He didn't know her name. "Can I offer you a ride?" She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She took one breath in and one breath out, and she thought about the 6 blocks and the heat and Emma's pink sneakers with the strap that sometimes came loose. She turned. "We're fine," she said. "Thank you." She watched something move across his face. Not offense, not dismissal, something more complicated, like he was adding something up and didn't entirely trust the sum. "It's 107 degrees, he said. "I'm aware of the temperature." Another moment. Then he nodded once, a small, precise thing, and didn't push. She turned back and walked Emma toward the gate and then out onto the sidewalk, And then she faced the 6 blocks and the heat, and she kept her face even and her chin level, and she didn't let herself feel any of it until they'd made it half a block, and she could be sure neither of them could see her. The bus stop had a bench with no shade and a posted schedule that turned out to be aspirational. They waited 22 minutes. Emma colored in her book. Nora read through her court documents again, even though she'd memorized them, because having something in her hands kept her from falling apart. The divorce was final. She had legal custody of Emma, primary residence pending stable housing. Trevor had visitation every other weekend, no overnights until Nora established a permanent address. She had 30 days to provide that address to the court. The motel did not count. She folded the documents carefully. She put them back in the folder. The bus came. That night, in the motel room with the air conditioner that worked in 40-minute cycles and then needed 20 minutes off to recover, she sat at the small table by the window while Emma slept, and she made a list on the back of a receipt. It was the kind of list you make when you're trying to impose order on chaos, when the actual size of the problem is too large to see all at once, and you need to break it into pieces that have the shape of things you could theoretically solve. Stable housing by day 30. Increased diner hours. Talk to Rosalind about extra shifts. Emma's school registration. She needed a proof of address for that too. The lawyer's remaining bill. Trevor's child support, which he had already called to inform her through his attorney he would be seeking to modify. Her phone bill, which was 4 days past due. $11. She put down the pen. Outside, the parking lot light buzzed and flickered. She watched it for a while. Then she picked the pen back up and wrote at the bottom of the list, in smaller handwriting than everything else. One thing at a time. She stared at it. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one she had, so she taped it to the bathroom mirror and she went to bed. 3 days passed. They had the particular texture of hard days. Nothing dramatic, just the sustained weight of difficulty. Nora worked a double on Thursday, a closing shift Friday, came in early Saturday to cover for Donna, who had a sick kid. She smiled at customers and refilled coffee and carried plates and laughed at jokes she didn't have the energy to find funny, and she was good at it the way you get good at things when they're the only thing standing between you and the alternative. The diner was called Rosalind's, which was the name of no one currently involved with the operation. It had been named by its original owner, Evelyn Brooks, who had sold the name along with everything else when she eventually passed the business on. Though the details of that transaction were something Nora knew only in outline. What she knew was the diner itself, the particular squeak of the 4th floorboard behind the counter, the way table 7's wobble required a folded napkin under the near leg, the coffee maker that needed the handle pressed down for a full 3 seconds or it spit grounds. She knew these things the way you know a place where you've spent 10 years of your life. She'd come to Rosalind's at 17, 2 months out of foster care, $70 to her name, hungry in a way that had settled so deep it had stopped feeling like hunger and started feeling like weather. She'd come in looking for a job, and Evelyn Brooks had looked her over for a long moment. Evelyn, who'd owned the diner then, who'd been 60 and deliberate and not easily moved, and had hired her on the spot and then sent her to the back room to eat something before she started. That was the whole story. It was also the only story that mattered. Saturday evening, during the dead hour between the lunch rush and dinner, she was wiping down the counter when the door opened. She registered the new customer the way you register things peripherally when you're tired, a shape, a movement, and reached for a menu before she looked up. She looked up. Adrian Vale didn't look like he belonged in Rosalind's diner. That wasn't a judgment. It was just a fact. He wore it the way expensive things do when they enter cheap spaces. Not badly, not with arrogance, just wrong in a way that had nothing to do with behavior and everything to do with fit. He was alone. He took a stool at the counter with the ease of someone who knew how to sit at counters, which surprised her. She put the menu in front of him. Coffee? Please. She poured it. She didn't say anything else, neither did he. He opened the menu and looked at it, and she went back to wiping the counter, because the counter still needed to be wiped. "How is he?" she said. She didn't look up. A beat. Better. He was back at the office yesterday. Against everyone's advice, but better. Good. She moved down the counter. He needs to stay hydrated. The blood pressure medication. He told me. He's wearing the lecture like a badge. Something in his voice suggested he found this mildly amusing. He also asked me to find out your name. He could have called the diner. He could have. I suggested that. He said, and I'm quoting, "I don't ask women I respect to come to me. I go to them," which is how I ended up here. She stopped wiping. She looked at him. He was watching her over the coffee cup. That same calculating without being calculating look she remembered from the parking lot. "My name is Nora Whitmore," she said. "He can send a card to the diner." He nodded slowly. He didn't leave. He ordered the chicken and waffles, which was not what she expected, and he ate it with attention, the way people eat when they actually taste things rather than performing the act. She found herself noticing this and found herself slightly annoyed at herself for noticing it. He was finishing his second cup of coffee when he said, "I have a job offer." She kept her face even. "I have a job. It's a consulting arrangement, short term, 2 weeks." He named a figure that made her hand resting on the counter go completely still. "There's a property my company is attempting to acquire. The seller has declined every approach from our legal team. I need someone who can actually have a conversation with her, understand what she needs, help us find a structure that works for everyone." She looked at him. "You want me to talk someone into selling something they don't want to sell? I want you to listen to someone explain why she doesn't want to sell, which is apparently a skill nobody on my team possesses." He set down the coffee cup. "I'm not asking you to manipulate anyone. I'm asking for a translator, someone who can bridge a gap." "What's the property?" He named a neighborhood she knew well. She felt something tighten in her chest, but kept her expression flat. "What's the seller's name?" He told her. "The thing about the color leaving your face is that you can't stop it. You can stop your mouth. You can stop your hands and your voice and the particular way your breath catches, but you cannot stop your blood making its small, quiet exit from your cheeks." She turned away on the pretense of checking the coffee maker and stood there for 3 seconds with her back to him and her eyes on the machine. "Evelyn Brooks." "Ms. Whitmore?" She turned back. "I need to think about it." He watched her. He wasn't stupid. Something had shifted in her and he'd seen it, and she could see that he'd seen it. But he didn't press on it, which was either strategic or decent, and she didn't yet know which. "Take your time," he said. He left a card on the counter with the bill. He paid in cash. Exact change plus what she later calculated was a 22% tip. She picked up the card after he left. She turned it over. She put it in her apron pocket. She went home to Emma that night and sat at the table with the motel notepad and wrote 2 columns. In the first column, she wrote what the money would mean: the apartment, the school registration, the lawyer, the cushion against Trevor's custody modification threat, the breathing room she hadn't had in 3 years of marriage and didn't have now. In the second column, she wrote one name: Evelyn. She stared at both columns for a long time. Her phone buzzed. Trevor's attorney, leaving a voicemail she didn't listen to tonight. She set the phone face down. The money in Adrian Vale's offer represented 9 months of her current salary, 2 weeks of work. It would change everything, which was exactly why she didn't trust it, because nothing that changed everything came without changing you in the process. She knew that. She'd learned that the way she'd learned most things, which was the hard way, in the body, after the fact. She pressed her fingers against the business card through her apron pocket. She thought about Evelyn at 17, handing her a plate of food before she'd earned a single dollar. She thought about Emma asleep in the next room, one pink sneaker still on her foot because she'd been too tired to take it off. She took the card out and looked at it. She was going to call. She already knew she was going to call. The only question she was still working through was what she was going to say when she found out exactly what Adrian Vale wanted done to the woman who had saved her life, and what she was going to do when those two things turned out to be completely incompatible. She put the card on the table. Outside, the parking lot light buzzed. Emma turned over in her sleep and said something small and unintelligible, and then went quiet. Nora sat very still in the dark and felt the walls of the things she was walking into, and she walked toward them anyway. She called the number on the card the next morning at 7:43. standing outside the motel room in the narrow strip of shade along the building's east wall while Emma ate cereal inside with the cartoon channel on low. The phone rang twice. Vale, not his assistant. Him. She registered that without commenting on it. It's Nora Whitmore, she said. From the diner. A brief pause. Not surprised, just the pause of someone shifting attention. Miss Whitmore? I have conditions. Another pause. Longer. Okay. I meet with the seller alone first, before I report anything back to you. I need to understand what she actually wants without your company's agenda sitting in the room with me. That's reasonable. I'm not finished. If I determine that what your company is proposing causes genuine harm to her, not inconvenience, not sentimentality, genuine harm, I walk, full payment regardless. Silence. She counted 4 seconds of it. The full payment regardless clause is going to be a problem for my legal team, he said. Then we don't have a deal. 5 more seconds. She listened to the ambient sound on his end. An office, air conditioning, something distant and institutional. Done, he said. I'll have the contract modified. You'll have it by noon. She looked out at the parking lot. A sparrow was investigating something near the dumpster with the focused intensity of something that didn't have the option of giving up. One more thing, she said. Go ahead. Why me? You have a legal team. You have PR people. You have an entire corporate infrastructure designed to smooth over exactly this kind of situation. So why are you standing in a diner asking a waitress to do it? The pause this time was different. Not calculation. Something closer to honesty, finding its shape. Because everyone I sent to talk to Evelyn Brooks came back with the same report, he said. That she's unreasonable. That she's emotional. That she doesn't understand the value of what she's sitting on. He stopped. And then, I watched you keep a 74-year-old man conscious in a parking lot in 107 degrees while my entire team stood around with their phones out. So my working theory is that the problem isn't Evelyn Brooks. Nora said nothing. The contract will be there by noon, he said, and ended the call. She stood in the strip of shade for another minute. The sparrow found whatever it was looking for and flew away. She went back inside and watched Emma eat cereal and didn't say anything about any of it, because there was nothing to say yet. Nothing certain enough to carry across the table to a 6-year-old who was already carrying more than she should have to. The contract arrived at 11:58. She read every line of it at the diner counter during her break, a habit she'd developed during the marriage when she'd learned too late that the things you don't read become the things that undo you. It said what he'd said it would say. She signed it. She called Evelyn that afternoon. The phone rang 6 times. She was preparing to leave a voicemail, so had already composed it in her head, careful and neutral, when the line clicked. Hello? Evelyn's voice was exactly the same. Nora had not consciously expected it to be different, but something in her chest loosened at the sound of it anyway, the way you feel a tension release that you didn't know you were holding. Evelyn, it's Nora. Nora Whitmore. A beat of pure silence, then, Nora. Not a question, just the name, repeated in a register that meant something. Where are you calling from? Phoenix. I've been here a while. I heard you might be... I wanted to come see you, if that's all right. All right. Pause. I'm at the house on Delaney. Same as always. Come for lunch tomorrow. I'll make something. You don't have to... I know I don't have to. The warmth in it was also a mild rebuke, the particular affectionate impatience of someone who's known you long enough to skip the part where you perform gratitude. Noon. Don't be late. She almost told her then. She almost said, I was approached by Adrian Vale's company, and I signed a contract, and there are things I need to explain before I sit at your table and eat your food. The words were right there. She didn't say them. Noon, she said. I'll be there. She spent the rest of the shift carrying the weight of that omission around like a stone in her pocket, bumping against everything. The house on Delaney Street was a pale yellow craftsman with a porch wide enough to matter, and a garden that had been tended so long it had opinions about itself. Roses trained up the left fence post, herbs in clay pots along the steps, A fig tree in the side yard that Nora remembered from the one time she'd been here before years ago, when Evelyn had invited the diner staff to a holiday dinner that Nora had almost not attended because she hadn't owned anything nice enough to wear. Evelyn had opened the door that night and looked at Nora in her second-hand blouse and said, "You look lovely," with such complete straightforwardness that Nora had believed her. She stood on the porch now and knocked. Evelyn Brooks was 71 years old and had the posture of someone who'd decided a long time ago that the world would have to come down to meet her because she wasn't going down to meet it. She was not tall. She'd never been tall, but she occupied space with an authority that had nothing to do with size. Her hair was white now, fully white, where it had been silver-streaked the last time Nora saw her. She looked at Nora in the doorway, and her face did something complicated and then simplified into a smile. "You're thin," she said. "Hello, Evelyn." "Come in. Don't argue with me about being thin. It's the first thing I noticed, and I'm allowed to say it." The inside of the house smelled like garlic and something herbed, and underneath all of it, the particular smell of a house that had been lived in by someone consistent, books, a little dust, decades of meals. Nora followed her through the hallway into the kitchen and sat at the table where Evelyn pointed and accepted the coffee that appeared in front of her without being asked and held the cup in both hands. "How long has it been?" Evelyn said. It wasn't quite a question. 4 years since I saw you, longer since we really talked." "Since the marriage?" "Yes." Evelyn made a sound that communicated her full and precisely calibrated opinion of Trevor Whitmore, without requiring her to name him. She put a bowl of soup in front of Nora, something with white beans and rosemary, and sat down across from her with her own cup of coffee, and looked at her with the kind of directness that some people find uncomfortable, and Nora had always found like oxygen. "Are you out?" she said. "Final last week." "And Emma?" "She's good. She's with me." Nora wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. "I have primary custody. There's a potential modification he's threatening, but his attorney is—" She stopped. "She's good. She's better now than she was." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And you?" Nora looked at her soup. "Working on it?" "That's an honest answer." Evelyn picked up her coffee. "Better than the ones you used to give me. You used to say fine like it was a door you could close." "I remember." They sat with that for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the fig tree moved slightly in some wind Nora couldn't feel from here. She should tell her now. She should put down the soup spoon and look across the table and say, "Evelyn, I came here in part because I was hired to come here, and I need you to know that before we go any further, because you gave me things you didn't have to give me, and I won't repay that with deception, even deception that pays me more money than I've seen in 3 years." She should say it. "The diner's being threatened," Evelyn said. Nora looked up. Evelyn was watching her with an expression that was calm in the way of things that have already decided how to be. "You knew, didn't you?" It wasn't a question this time either. Nora set down the spoon. "Yes." The kitchen went quiet enough that she could hear the refrigerator's hum and the distant movement of the fig tree and her own pulse in her ears. "Who sent you?" Evelyn said. "Adrian Vale's company. They approached me 3 days ago. I signed a consulting contract." She held Evelyn's gaze. She owed her that much, at least. "My conditions were that I'd meet with you alone first, and that if I decided their proposal caused you genuine harm, I'd walk regardless of payment. I should have told you on the phone. I didn't. That was wrong." Evelyn said nothing for a long moment. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the window. Then she looked back at Nora. "Did you come because of the money?" she said. "Yes," Nora said, "because there was no version of dignity that involved lying to this woman. And because I needed to see for myself what they were actually asking you to give up. Those two things are both true at the same time, and I'm not going to pretend one of them isn't." Evelyn was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, a clock was ticking. "All right," Evelyn said finally. "All right? All right. I'll tell you." She stood and went to the window and looked out at the fig tree with her arms folded over her chest, not defensive. More like a woman gathering something before she speaks. "That diner is not a building to me, Nora. I know that sounds like exactly the thing an unreasonable old woman says when she's holding up a business deal. I know how it looks from the outside. She paused. I opened that diner when I was 33 years old. My husband had just died. I had $200 and a commercial lease I could barely cover, and no business training, and nothing but the absolute conviction that I needed to build something that couldn't be taken away. Nora didn't say anything. For 38 years, that building fed people, not just food. Evelyn turned from the window. You know what I mean. You were one of them. Nora's throat tightened. I know. They want to put a tower there, 60 stories. They'll put my name on the lobby. A sound came out of her, not quite a laugh. My name on a lobby, in a building where a cup of coffee costs $14 and the people who used to sit at my counter couldn't afford to park nearby. She came back to the table and sat down. That neighborhood is already changing. I can't stop that, but I'm not going to be the person who hands them the last piece of it with a smile. Nora sat with that. She sat with all of it. The weight of the money on one side, the weight of this room and this woman and what she owed her on the other. She thought about Emma's school registration. She thought about Trevor's attorney's voicemail sitting on her phone unlistened to. What would you need, she said, if there was a version of this that worked for you? Not for them, for you. What would it look like? Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. You're still trying to find the bridge. Yes. Even now. Yes. Evelyn picked up her coffee. I'd need the diner to stay. Not the name on a lobby. The actual building, the actual tables, the actual counter. Protected. In perpetuity. Not a 10-year preservation agreement that gets renegotiated when a different board is sitting. She paused. And I'd need the neighborhood to have something real. Not a community fund that gets spent on marketing materials. Not a mural. Real. Housing, a kitchen program, something that does what I tried to do for 40 years. Nora wrote none of this down. She committed it to memory, the way she'd committed orders to memory for a decade, not by trying to remember, but by listening with her whole body. I can bring that back to them, she said. And then what? And then we'll see if they mean what they say, or if they're just telling me what I want to hear. She paused. Either way, I'll tell you the truth about it, whatever it is. Evelyn looked at her for a long time. You've gotten harder, she said. Not a criticism. I've had a few years. Does it hurt less? Nora thought about it honestly. Different, she said. Not less. Different. Evelyn nodded like this was the right answer. She picked up the soup bowls and took them to the sink and ran the water over them, and Nora sat at the table and felt the full complexity of what she'd just agreed to carry, and didn't flinch from any of it. She met with Adrian Vale the next morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building that was entirely made of glass and light, and the particular atmosphere of serious money. Not showy money, the kind of money that's been somewhere long enough to stop needing to announce itself. His assistant brought water. He was already at the table when she arrived, which she noted. No power move entrance. He was reading something and set it aside when she came in. How was she? He said. She was fine. Nora sat down. She told me what she needs. I'm going to tell you, and I need you to hear it as a real proposal and not as an opening position in a negotiation. He folded his hands on the table. Go ahead. She laid it out. All of it. The diner in perpetuity, the community infrastructure, the specific and non-negotiable distinction between a preserved name and a preserved place. She spoke evenly and without editorializing and watched his face while she did. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make the small, dismissive sounds that people make when they're just waiting for you to finish. He listened the way she'd learned to recognize listening, with his body still and his eyes present and his reactions not performed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The building in perpetuity is structurally possible, he said. We've done modified development agreements before where a ground floor structure is maintained independent of the tower. It reduces the site's yield, but it's not unprecedented. He paused. The community component, what she described, housing and kitchen infrastructure, that's a different scale. That's not impossible. but it requires a different kind of commitment than a line item in a community benefits agreement. She knows the difference between a commitment and a line item, Nora said. That's why she's been saying no. He looked at her. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, the story your team brought back was that she's unreasonable. That's a very different story from she's been offered the wrong things by people who weren't listening. A muscle moved in his jaw. Not anger, something closer to self-correction. The look of someone who has just been accurately described doing something they don't like. You're right, he said. That's a failure on my side. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected deflection, or the polished corporate acknowledgement that means nothing. She stayed even. So what happens now? I need to take this to the board. There are investors in this development who have very specific return expectations, and what Evelyn's asking for compresses those returns. He picked up his pen and set it down. I want to find a structure that works. I'm telling you that plainly. What I can't tell you yet is whether the board will let me. How long? A week, maybe less. She stood. I'll tell Evelyn there's movement. I won't tell her more than that until there's more than that. She picked up her bag. One more thing. He looked up. The executives who handled the initial approach to Evelyn, she said. The ones who came back and told you she was unreasonable. Did you ask them specifically what she said, or did you ask them what she decided? He went very still. Because those are different questions, she said, and the answer to the first one would have told you everything you needed to know 3 months ago. She left him sitting with that and took the elevator down and walked out into the heat and called Evelyn to tell her there was movement, and Evelyn said, "We'll see," with the patience of someone who had been watching people make promises for 40 years and had developed precise instruments for measuring the gap between what they said and what they did. Nora had been home from that meeting for 40 minutes when her phone rang. Not a number she knew. She answered it anyway because she'd learned that the things you don't pick up have a way of finding you regardless. Miss Whitmore, a man's voice, clipped, precise, the particular vocal texture of someone who's spent decades in rooms where imprecision costs money. My name is Sterling Vaughn. I'm a principal investor in the Vale Meridian Development Project. A pause. I understand you've been engaged as a consulting intermediary. She stood very still in the center of the motel room. Emma was at the table doing a puzzle, her back to Nora, fitting pieces together with the patient concentration of someone who trusted that everything had a place. That's correct, Nora said. I want to offer you some context, Vaughn said. As a courtesy, the development timeline on this project is fixed. There are capital commitments, construction contracts, and financing instruments that do not flex to accommodate personal sentiment, however legitimate that sentiment may be. His voice was warm in a way that had nothing warm in it. What Evelyn Brooks is asking for cannot happen within the project parameters. What Mr. Vale may have suggested to you about structural alternatives reflects his, let's say, his optimism, which is one of his most admirable qualities and occasionally one of his most costly ones. Is there something you want from me, Mr. Vaughn? I want you to understand the landscape, he said, so that when you carry information back to Miss Brooks, you carry accurate information. And I want you to know that there are people watching this process very carefully who have an interest in it resolving quickly. Another pause. Including people with an interest in your family situation. I understand you have a custody matter. The room went cold. Nora didn't move. She didn't breathe differently. She kept her eyes on Emma's back, the small, precise hands fitting 2 pieces together, the slight tilt of her head when something clicked. That's an interesting thing to bring up in a conversation about a real estate deal, she said. I find it clarifies priorities, Vaughn said. Mr. Vaughn, she kept her voice level and quiet. I want you to hear me say this clearly so there's no misunderstanding later. Whatever you think you're doing right now, I want you to know that it has not had the effect you intended. She paused. Goodbye. She ended the call. She stood there in the center of the room for 5 full seconds. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Sterling Vaughn knew about the custody case. That meant someone had connected her engagement with Vale's company to Trevor's ongoing legal action, which meant someone was feeding information between those two situations deliberately, building a pressure point. That was not coincidence. Coincidence didn't know your custody attorney's filing timeline. Mama? Emma had turned around. She had a puzzle piece in each hand and was watching Nora with the expression that children wear when they're not sure whether to ask. Come here, Nora said. Emma came and climbed up onto the bed beside her, and Nora put her arm around her and held her and looked at the wall and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical in its precision, that she had just walked into something much larger and much older than a real estate disagreement. She thought about Vaughn's voice, the warmth in it that had nothing warm in it, the specific deliberate mention of the custody matter, not a threat made explicit, just made visible, the way you light something in a dark room so the other person can see exactly how trapped they are. She needed to call Adrian Vale. She needed to tell him what just happened. And she needed to do it before she decided whether she still trusted him enough for that call to be safe. Because if Vaughn was operating independently, Adrian might not know. And if Vaughn was operating with Adrian's knowledge, then everything she thought she understood about this situation needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. She picked up her phone. She looked at his number. Emma leaned her head against Nora's arm and said, "Is the puzzle hard, Mama?" The puzzle? Nora looked at the table. The half-finished image. Some kind of forest scene. Animals she couldn't quite make out from here. Which piece are you stuck on? The blue ones all look the same. They're not, though, Nora said. Look closer. There are small differences in every single one. She looked down at Emma's upturned face. That's how you tell them apart. Emma considered this and climbed back down and went back to the puzzle, and Nora looked at her phone and pressed call and listened to it ring and understood, in the space between rings, that she had just passed the point where any of this could be undone, that she was now inside a fight she hadn't agreed to fight, for stakes nobody had fully disclosed, and the only question left was whether she was going to fight it on her own terms or someone else's. Adrian picked up on the second ring. I just got off the phone with Sterling Vaughn, she said, and you need to tell me right now whether you knew he was going to call me, because what I do next depends entirely on the answer to that question. The silence on his end lasted exactly long enough to tell her that whatever came next was going to change everything she thought she knew about who was actually running this deal, and who had been setting her up from the very beginning. The silence on Adrian's end lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. No, he said. I didn't know he was going to call you. She listened to the way he said it. Not fast, not the speed of someone covering, flat and contained, the way a person speaks when they're managing something that's just surprised them. Tell me exactly what he said, Adrian said. He told me the timeline is fixed, that what Evelyn is asking for can't happen within the project parameters, and then he mentioned my custody case. She paused. By name, not as a general reference. He knew specifics. 3 seconds of silence. How specific? Specific enough that it wasn't a guess. She heard him breathe out through his nose. Where are you right now? My motel. I'm coming to you. No, she said it fast and flat. Not here. Not where Emma is. She thought for a second. Rosalind's diner. 1 hour. Come alone. She ended the call before he could respond and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the room around her doing its small domestic things. The air conditioner cycling, Emma fitting puzzle pieces together, a truck passing on the highway outside. All of it indifferent to the fact that something had just cracked open beneath her. She called her attorney next. She got voicemail. This is Nora Whitmore. I need you to call me back as soon as you get this. Someone outside the custody proceeding has accessed information about the case. I don't know how much they know or how they got it. I need to know if there's been any contact with Trevor's legal team from a third party. Specifically, anyone connected to a real estate development company called Vale Meridian or an investor named Sterling Vaughn. She paused. Please call me back today. She hung up and looked at Emma. Baby, we're going to go to the diner for a little while, okay? I have to talk to someone. Emma looked up from the puzzle. Can I bring Gerald? Yes, bring Gerald. She drove them in the rental car she'd put on her last credit card 3 days ago and didn't think about the cost of it, because the cost of it was the kind of number that would paralyze her if she looked at it directly, and she couldn't afford to be paralyzed right now. Rosalind's was between rushes. Donna was on the floor and lifted her eyebrows when Nora came in off shift, but Nora shook her head slightly and Donna read it correctly and didn't ask. Nora settled Emma in the corner booth with her coloring books and a hot chocolate and went to the counter to wait. Adrian came in at 53 minutes. He was wearing different clothes than she'd seen him in before. Not a suit, just dark pants and a shirt with the sleeves already rolled like he'd left somewhere quickly. He scanned the room when he entered, found her at the counter, and came directly. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look around. He sat down and looked at her. "Tell me everything he said," he said, "word for word as close as you can get it." She told him. She had a good memory and she'd been running the conversation on repeat since she'd hung up, so she got most of it accurately. He listened without interrupting, and his face did several things she tracked carefully. A tightening around the eyes at the custody mention, something that moved through his jaw at the phrase project parameters. When she finished, he was quiet. "How long has Vaughn been an investor in this development?" she said. 4 years. He came in at the Series B financing round. He holds about 19% of the equity in the Meridian project. Adrian picked up the coffee she hadn't offered him, but that Donna had apparently put in front of him by some automatic diner law. "He's not supposed to have operational involvement. That's the structure. Principal investors don't manage deal execution." "But he called me." "Yes." "Which means either the structure isn't being respected or someone gave him access to information he shouldn't have operationally." She folded her hands on the counter. "How did he know about my custody case, Adrian?" He met her eyes. She'd used his first name without planning to, and neither of them commented on it. "I don't know," he said. "Think about who in your organization knew I'd been brought on. My assistant, my general counsel, the 2 executives who handled the initial Evelyn approach." He stopped. "And the HR team that processed your contract. That's at minimum 5 people." "Yes. And any of them could have a relationship with Vaughn." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The answer was sitting between them on the counter like something neither of them wanted to pick up. "I need you to understand something," Nora said. She kept her voice low, level, the voice she used when what she was saying mattered enough to not dress up. "I came into this because I needed the money, and I thought I could manage the competing obligations. I thought I could be honest with Evelyn and useful to your company and protect my daughter at the same time." She paused. "If someone is using my custody case as a pressure instrument, that calculation changes completely. I don't do anything that puts Emma at risk. Not for any amount of money. Not for any version of this deal." "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" "Because you're sitting on the other side of a very large financial interest, and I need to know if that changes what you're willing to do." He looked at her steadily. "What would you need from me?" "I need to know everything about Vaughn's involvement in this project. Not what the structure says, what's actually been happening, who he talks to on your team, what he's been told, whether he's had any contact with Trevor Whitmore's legal representation." She watched his face when she said Trevor's name. Nothing shifted. That was either honesty or very good control, and she didn't yet know which. "And I need that information today. Not when it's convenient. Today." He pulled out his phone. He made a call right there at the counter, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to say he'd look into it, to take the request back to some office process. Instead, he called someone named Garrett and said, in a voice that had shed the careful modulations of a corporate conversation and gotten quieter and more direct, "I need a full audit of Sterling Vaughn's communications with anyone on the Meridian team in the last 60 days. Internal emails, call logs, meeting records, everything. I need it by 6 tonight." A pause. "No. Tonight, Garrett." He ended the call. He put the phone on the counter. He looked at her. "I'll have it by 6. She looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to read the thing underneath the surface of him, the part that was either genuine or a better performance than she'd encountered before. She'd spent 3 years married to a man who'd performed sincerity with great skill, and she'd learned to look for it in the details, in the places people didn't think to control. The way he'd called Garrett without staging it. The specific quiet of his voice on that call. The way he wasn't trying to reassure her. "Okay," she said. He nodded once. He started to get up, then stopped. "The custody modification Trevor's threatening. What's the basis of it? She didn't answer immediately. Stable housing, he said, reading her silence. He's using your housing situation. Among other things? What's your timeline on the stable housing requirement? 23 days. He was quiet for a moment. The contract payment, the first installment was supposed to be released at the 2-week mark. I can move that up, today, if you need it. She felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with suspicion. It was worse than suspicion. It was the dangerous softening that happened when someone did something genuinely useful without being asked. And she'd learned to be careful of that softening because it was exactly the place where her judgment had failed her before. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Don't do things that make me feel like I owe you something, she said. I need to be able to look at everything you do clearly. If you start solving my problems outside the contract, I lose that. She paused. I know what you're trying to do and it's not wrong, but I need you to not do it. Something moved across his face. Not offense, not the withdrawal of someone who'd been corrected. Something that looked unexpectedly like respect. Understood, he said. He left cash on the counter for the coffee and walked out. And Nora sat for a moment and then went to check on Emma, who had colored 3 pages and was starting on a 4th and had named all of Gerald's imaginary friends after planets. At 6:12 that evening, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar email address. It contained a link to a secure file and a 4-digit access code and no other explanation. She opened it on the motel room laptop she'd borrowed from the diner's back office. What she read over the next 40 minutes rearranged her understanding of everything that had happened since she'd signed Adrian Vale's contract. Sterling Vaughn had been in contact with 3 members of the Vale Meridian executive team over the previous 45 days, not through official channels, through personal email addresses, and 2 in-person meetings that hadn't been logged in the company calendar system. The subjects of those communications, pieced together from the partial records in the audit, were not limited to project returns or development timelines. One email thread between Vaughn and a senior VP named Marcus Hale referenced something called the Brooks contingency. She read that phrase 3 times. The Brooks contingency. Not the Brooks negotiation. Not the Brooks acquisition. Contingency. A plan for a situation that hadn't yet occurred but was being prepared for regardless. She scrolled further. There was a meeting note, informal, a bullet point summary that Hale had apparently sent to himself as a personal record, that referenced a coordinated approach. The phrase used was parallel pressure. The note referenced the diner on one line and on the next line, in the same breath, referenced the Whitmore custody file. Nora sat very still. They had known about her before Adrian brought her in, or someone had known. Someone in the room when the decision to engage her was made, which meant her hiring had not been Adrian's independent idea executed in good faith. It had been anticipated, possibly engineered. Someone had looked at her situation, the divorce, the custody threat, the financial pressure, and identified her as a lever before she'd ever picked up that phone and called to give her conditions. She thought about how fast Adrian had agreed to her conditions. Walk if there's genuine harm, full payment regardless. She thought it was because he was reasonable. She now had to ask whether it was because she was already inside a plan she hadn't been shown. She picked up her phone. Her hand was steady. She'd noticed she did that, went physically still and controlled when she was most frightened, the opposite of what people expected. She'd been doing it since she was 17 and it had never fully stopped. She called Adrian. He picked up on one ring. Did you know? She said. Before you hired me. Did anyone tell you that Vaughn or Marcus Hale had already been looking at my custody case? A pause. What did the audit show? Answer my question. Nora, answer it. The silence was 4 seconds again. 4 seconds exactly, like they were synchronized. No, he said. I didn't know. But someone in the room when you decided to hire me might have. Another pause. Longer. Possibly. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. Who was in the room? My general counsel, my assistant, Marcus Hale. A beat. Hale suggested your name. The room did not change. The air conditioner cycled. Emma was asleep in the other bed with Gerald tucked under her arm. Everything was exactly where it had been 30 seconds ago, and all of it looked different. Marcus Hale had suggested her name. Marcus Hale, whose meeting notes contained the phrase parallel pressure in the same sentence as her custody file. She hadn't been hired because Adrian Vale watched her keep Samuel Mercer conscious in a parking lot and thought she had a quality his team lacked. That was real. She believed his account of it was real, but someone else in that room had taken his genuine impulse and shaped it, had pointed it at her specifically, had looked at her $11 and her 23-day deadline and her custody threat and seen not a consultant but a pressure point that could be inserted between Adrian Vale's better instincts and Evelyn Brooks's refusal, and used. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that how you answer this is going to determine everything that happens next." "Go ahead." "Is Marcus Hale still on this project?" A long pause. "Yes." "Then we have a problem." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot where the light still buzzed and flickered its indifferent fluorescent buzz. "Because Hale isn't just a leak. He's a mechanism. Vaughn has someone inside your organization who helped design the situation I'm currently in, which means every conversation I've had that involved anyone on your team has potentially been monitored and fed back to Vaughn." She paused. "Including the conversation where Evelyn told me what she actually needs." She heard him register that. Not a sound, more an absence of sound, the particular quality of a silence that's been hit with something it wasn't prepared for. "If Vaughn knows what Evelyn's real conditions are," she said, "then he's already 3 steps ahead of any structure you bring to the board. He'll know exactly where to apply pressure to make it fall apart." "I'll remove Hale from the project tonight." "That's not enough, and you know it." She turned from the window. "Vaughn has 19% equity. He has board relationships. Removing Hale doesn't remove Vaughn. It just tells Vaughn that you know, which changes how he operates but doesn't stop him." She thought for a moment, running the edges of it. What does Vaughn actually want? Not the development return. He could get that anywhere. What does this project specifically give him? Adrian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Something in it gone flat and careful in a way she hadn't heard before. "There's a zoning reclassification attached to the Meridian development. If the Brooks site gets incorporated into the full block acquisition, it unlocks a density variance that adds 18 floors to the tower. Those 18 floors have a separate financing instrument behind them, a different set of investors." He stopped. "Vaughn holds a carried interest in that instrument. So Evelyn's specific property, not just the block, her building, is what unlocks the value he actually cares about." "Yes." "Which means he can't let her hold out, not because of the timeline, because without her building specifically, his 18 floors don't exist." "Yes." She sat back down at the table. The full shape of it was visible now, all the way to its edges, and it was bigger than she'd thought and older than her involvement in it, and completely indifferent to the damage it would do on its way to its conclusion. "He'll go after Emma," she said. "Nora. I'm not being dramatic, I'm being precise." She kept her voice low and even. He already demonstrated he knows about the custody case. The logical next move, if I don't facilitate what he needs, is to provide Trevor's legal team with whatever he's gathered. Anything that hurts my stability hearing, housing, income, associations. She paused. "My association with a contentious real estate deal would not look good in front of a family court judge." Adrian said nothing. She appreciated that he didn't try to tell her she was wrong. "There's something else," she said. Her voice was different now, and she couldn't fully account for the shift. Something had settled in her, or hardened. She wasn't sure which. "My attorney called me back an hour ago. Trevor's legal team filed a motion yesterday. A new one, beyond the modification. They're requesting an emergency stability review." She paused. "The filing cites my recent changes in employment status and living situation. It was filed by a junior associate at Trevor's firm, a junior associate who joined that firm 8 months ago." She let the timing sit in the air between them. "From a position at Vaughn Capital." The silence on the line was total. She let it stay that way for 3 seconds. Then she said, "This started before the parking lot, before you hired me, before I ever picked up your business card." She pressed her fingers against the table's surface, feeling the grain of the wood, grounding herself in the specific physical reality of the room. Someone built this situation. They put all the pieces in position, and then they needed a bridge, someone Evelyn would actually talk to. And they pointed you at me because I fit every requirement. I needed money. I had a connection to Evelyn. I had a vulnerability they could activate if I stopped being useful. She stopped. I was the last piece they needed to put in place. She heard him breathe. What do you want to do? I want to do what you hired me to do, she said. I want to help Evelyn, but I can't do that from inside a structure that's been compromised from the beginning. She thought for a moment. I need you to do something that is going to cost you. Tell me. I need you to call a board meeting, full board, not executive committee, and I need you to lay out everything. Vaughn's communications with Hale, the parallel pressure strategy, the carried interest in the density variance instrument. All of it. She paused. And I need you to do it before Vaughn gets wind that the audit happened. A long pause. If I do that, Vaughn will counter. He has relationships on that board. He'll reframe it as internal dysfunction, use it to move against my operational authority on the project. Yes, she said. He probably will. I could lose control of the development. Yes. Silence. Then, you're asking me to blow up my own deal. I'm asking you to decide what you're actually willing to protect. She didn't say it hard. She said it the way she'd learned to say the things that mattered. Quiet and direct, without the performance of confrontation. Because right now, Vaughn is using your company to threaten a 71-year-old woman and a 6-year-old child, and he's doing it through a structure you built. You can dismantle that structure, or you can pretend you didn't see the audit. She paused. I can't make that choice for you. The silence stretched out long enough that she began to count again. 8 seconds. 9. I'll call the board meeting, he said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She let out a slow breath. There's one more thing you should know. What? I'm going to tell Evelyn everything tonight before the board meeting. She deserves to know how she's been played, and she deserves to know it from me, not from the outcome of a meeting she wasn't invited to. She stood up from the table again. She may decide to pull out of everything entirely, including any arrangement with your company. If she does, that's her right. I know, he said, and you're okay with that. It doesn't matter if I'm okay with it, he said. It's her property. She was quiet for a moment. It was the right answer. She didn't tell him it was the right answer because that wasn't her job, but she registered it. She drove to Delaney Street at 8:15 that evening, with Emma asleep in the back seat and Gerald tucked against her chin, and the motel window she'd left cracked because the air conditioner needed its recovery time. Evelyn answered the door in a housecoat and reading glasses pushed up on her head and took one look at Nora's face and said, "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." They sat at the kitchen table, the same 2 chairs, the same refrigerator hum. And Nora told her everything. She didn't soften it. She didn't editorialize or manage the sequence to make herself look better than she'd been. She laid it out the way she'd laid out Evelyn's conditions to Adrian that morning, which already felt like it had happened to a different version of her. Evelyn listened with her hands wrapped around her tea mug and her face doing nothing dramatic. She was the least dramatic person Nora had ever known, which had always made her more frightening than people who performed composure, because with Evelyn you knew the stillness was actual. When Nora finished, Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "This man Vaughn," she said, "he had someone placed at Trevor's law firm 8 months ago, before the divorce was filed. So he's been building this for almost a year. That's what it looks like." Evelyn turned her mug slowly between her palms. "And you're in the middle of it because I connected to both sides, and because I'm pressable." She said it without bitterness, just the fact of it. "I have a child and no stable income, and a custody proceeding. That's a pressure point." Vaughn looked at me and saw a lever. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Did he miscalculate?" Nora met her eyes. "Yes," she said. "He did." Something shifted in Evelyn's face, not quite a smile, more like recognition, like she was seeing something she'd suspected a long time ago confirmed in real time. "The board meeting is tomorrow at 8, Nora said. "Adrian will present everything. I don't know how the board will respond. Vaughn has relationships there. There's a real possibility he survives it, and Adrian loses operational authority." She paused. If that happens, the development proceeds on Vaughn's terms. You lose the diner, and I lose the custody case. And if Adrian survives it, then we have a chance to build something real. The structure Evelyn described, the diner in perpetuity, the community infrastructure. It's structurally possible. Adrian said so. Evelyn was quiet. She looked at the window, the same window she'd looked at before, the fig tree out there somewhere in the dark. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing tonight. I just needed you to know before it happened." Nora paused. "But tomorrow, after the board meeting, whatever the outcome, I think you should be at the table, not represented by an attorney, you, in person." She looked at her steadily. "Because the whole problem from the beginning is that nobody in that building has ever actually had to sit across from you and see what they're asking you to give up. I think they should have to do that." Evelyn considered it. She took a sip of tea. She put the mug down. "What time?" she said. Nora drove back to the motel with Emma still asleep in the back seat, and the city going dark around her and something building in her chest that wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too light for what she was carrying. It was more like determination that had gone past the point of arguing with itself. She'd stopped asking whether this was going to work and started asking what she was going to do when it didn't, because that was the more honest question, and she'd spent too long asking the wrong ones. She parked. She carried Emma inside and laid her down without waking her and stood at the foot of the bed in the dark and watched her breathe. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't know. She opened it. 3 words. "Check your email." She opened her email. There was a new message, no sender name, just a string of random characters as the address. The subject line was blank. The body contained a single attachment, a PDF. She opened it. It was a court document, her custody case. But it wasn't the modification filing she already knew about. It was something new, filed that afternoon at 4:57 p.m., after business hours. Expedited emergency classification. A request for immediate temporary custody transfer to Trevor Whitmore on the grounds of maternal instability. Attached as Exhibit A was a photograph. Taken today. From outside. Through the window of Rosalind's diner. It showed Nora at the counter, Adrian Vale sitting beside her, both of them leaning toward each other in the way people do when they're speaking quietly about something they don't want overheard. The caption typed beneath it read, "Subject engaged in undisclosed business relationship with high-profile associate, while minor child left unattended in establishment." Emma had been 12 feet away in a corner booth coloring a picture. Nora set the phone down on the table. She picked it back up. She looked at the photograph again. The specific angle of it, the level of zoom, the fact that it was through glass but clear, not a casual phone shot. Someone had been positioned outside that diner. Someone had been there before Adrian arrived, waiting. She had been watched, not stumbled upon. Watched, positioned, photographed with intent. Vaughn hadn't waited for the board meeting. He'd moved tonight because he knew the audit had happened, which meant there was someone inside Adrian's organization who had told him about the audit within hours of it being run. And that person was still there, still inside, still feeding information to the man who was now attempting to take her daughter. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not look at Emma. She looked at the wall. She had 12 hours before the board meeting. She had a temporary custody motion filed against her that painted her as negligent and entangled. She had a photograph that would look exactly as damaging as it was designed to look to anyone who didn't know the context, which was every person in that courtroom who wasn't her. She thought about the motel notepad. She thought about one thing at a time taped to the bathroom mirror. She stood up and went to the mirror and looked at it for a long moment, and then she took it down and folded it and put it in her pocket, and she picked up her phone and she started to dial the one number she'd been avoiding since she understood how deep this went. Because the person she was calling wasn't going to be glad to hear from her, and wasn't going to make any of what came next easier, but had spent 40 years building something out of nothing in the face of people exactly like Sterling Vaughn. And right now that was the only qualification that mattered. The line rang twice. Then Evelyn's voice, alert despite the hour, like she'd been sitting up waiting for exactly this. "I know," Evelyn said before Nora could speak. "I saw it too. Someone sent it to me as well." Nora closed her eyes. He's trying to isolate us, she said. Separate us from Adrian before the board meeting. If I'm fighting a custody emergency, I can't be in that room, and if you're… Nora, Evelyn's voice was quiet and exact and cut right through the middle of the spiral. Listen to me. She listened. He made a mistake, Evelyn said. He showed us exactly how frightened he is. You don't move this fast unless you're running out of time. A pause. That photograph means he doesn't have anything real. If he had something real, he wouldn't need a staged picture through a diner window. Nora stood very still. Come to my house, Evelyn said. Bring Emma. Don't stay in that motel tonight. A pause. And call Adrian Vale and tell him to move the board meeting to 6 a.m. Because whatever Vaughn's doing next, we need to be one step ahead of it before the sun comes up. Nora looked at Emma asleep in the dim room and at the photograph on her phone, and at the space between those two things that she was now going to have to cross alone, except that she wasn't alone, which was the one part of this she hadn't seen coming. She picked up her keys. She drove to Delaney Street at 11:47 p.m. with Emma wrapped in a blanket in the back seat, and Gerald clutched against her chest, and the photograph still open on her phone on the passenger seat, where she could see it every time she stopped at a light. She didn't look at it again. She didn't need to. It was already the kind of image that lives behind your eyes once you've seen it. The specific angle of surveillance, the deliberateness of it, the way it had been framed to mean exactly what Vaughn needed it to mean in front of a judge who didn't know her. Evelyn had the porch light on. She opened the door before Nora knocked, which meant she'd been watching from the window, which meant she hadn't slept either. Come in, she said, and took Emma from Nora's arms with the practiced ease of a woman who'd held sleeping children before, and carried her down the hall to the guest room without another word. Nora stood in the entryway and breathed. The house smelled the same as it had at lunch, garlic underneath everything, and books, and the faint ghost of decades of meals. She followed the sound of the kettle into the kitchen and sat down at the table and put her phone face down and pressed her hands flat on the wood and worked on breathing at a normal rate. Evelyn came back and poured 2 cups without asking and sat down. Tell me what your attorney said, she said. I left a voicemail. She hasn't called back. Do you have someone else you can call tonight? I have the attorney's emergency line. I've been deciding whether to use it. She picked up the cup. If I file a response to the emergency motion tonight, it becomes a matter of record that I was notified, which puts it on the timeline, which means the hearing could be scheduled as early as tomorrow afternoon. And tomorrow morning is the board meeting. Yes. Evelyn looked at her over her own cup. You can't be in 2 places. No. Which one matters more? Nora set down the cup. It was the most direct version of the question, and she'd been not asking it for the last 40 minutes in the car. Emma matters more. Emma is always the answer to that question. She paused. But if the board meeting fails, Vaughn keeps his position, keeps his instrument inside Adrian's organization, and keeps feeding Trevor's attorneys. So the board meeting is also about Emma. Everything right now is also about Emma. Evelyn was quiet. Call Adrian, she said. Right now. Not in the morning. Now. Nora called him. He answered in 2 rings, which meant he wasn't sleeping either, which meant he'd been waiting. The motion, he said, before she could speak. You know. Garrett flagged it an hour ago. It was filed through a subsidiary of a firm that Vaughn uses for… He stopped. It doesn't matter. I know about it. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated he'd move tonight. I need the board meeting at 6 a.m., she said. Not 8. A pause. I can do that. And I need you to tell me right now if there's anyone else on that board besides Vaughn who knew about the parallel pressure strategy. Anyone who might have had advanced knowledge of the Hale operation. A longer pause. There may be one, a board member named Clifton Reese. He and Vaughn have a 20-year relationship. I haven't been able to confirm anything, but if Vaughn has a second position on the board, it's Reese. How many board members total? 9. If you lose Vaughn and Reese, you have 7. Assuming all 7 stay with me, which I can't guarantee before 6 a.m. No, she said. You can't. She thought for a moment. Who on that board has ever actually been to the neighborhood where Evelyn's diner is? Silence. I don't know. Find out. Tonight. She paused. And send me everything you have on Vaughn's carried interest in the density variance instrument. The financing documents, the investor agreements, everything. I want the actual numbers. Nora, you're not a corporate attorney. No, she said. I'm not. Send them anyway. He sent them. She spent the next 2 hours at Evelyn's kitchen table reading financing documents with a legal dictionary open on her phone, and Evelyn sitting across from her reading the same documents, because Evelyn had run a business for 38 years and knew how to read a contract even if she'd never held a corporate law degree. They didn't talk much. They made marks on a yellow legal pad that Evelyn found in a kitchen drawer. They drank 2 more cups of tea. At 2:17 a.m., Evelyn set down the page she was reading and said, "Look at this." Nora looked. It was the carried interest agreement, Vaughn's specific instrument in the density variance floors. Evelyn had her finger on a clause in the middle of the 3rd page. Small print. The kind of language that exists because lawyers are paid to bury the things that matter. Nora read it. Then she read it again. The clause stated that Vaughn's carried interest in the 18 additional floors was contingent on the full block acquisition being completed within the original project timeline. If the timeline was extended by more than 60 days for any reason, including negotiation delays with individual property holders, the carried interest reverted to the primary development entity. Vale Meridian. She looked up at Evelyn. "He's already passed 60 days, Evelyn said quietly. "I've been saying no for 4 months. Nora did the math. He lost the carried interest 11 weeks ago. Unless no one's noticed yet. Evelyn's face was absolutely still. Or unless he's been preventing anyone from noticing. Nora understood it in the full then. The entire architecture of the thing, all the way down to its foundation. Vaughn wasn't threatening her and Evelyn because he needed the deal to succeed. He was threatening them because he needed to prevent the board from looking at the timeline too closely. The emergency custody motion, the photograph, the pressure on Nora. None of it was about acquiring Evelyn's property. It was about buying enough chaos to keep everyone's attention away from a clause in a financing document that had already cost him everything he'd built this around. He was running. "He knows," she said. "He knows he already lost the interest. This whole thing, the Hale operation, the custody filing, all of it, it's a smokescreen. He's trying to force a fast resolution before anyone runs the timeline and finds this." Evelyn put her palms flat on the table. Her face was the face of someone who has waited a long time for a thing to become clear. "Can you prove it?" "The dates are in the document. The 4-month negotiation history is in the correspondence records Adrian sent." She was already reaching for her phone. "Yes, I can prove it." She called Adrian at 2:22 a.m. "The carried interest is already void," she said the moment he answered. "Clause 7C of the variance instrument, 60-day timeline. Evelyn has been in negotiation for 4 months. Vaughn lost the interest in week 11. Look at your calendar. The first formal approach to Evelyn was documented when?" She heard him pulling something up, heard the sound of papers or a keyboard, then silence, then January 14th. "And today is May 21st. His voice had changed, flattened into something precise and contained. "That's 18 weeks. 11 past the contingency window." She pressed her finger against the legal pad. "He's been operating inside your company for months to cover up the fact that he already lost his position. Every threat, every piece of pressure. It's not about getting the deal done. It's about making sure nobody looks at the timeline before he can find a way to reset it or renegotiate the clause." A long silence. "He needs a board vote to renegotiate that clause," Adrian said slowly. "Yes?" "Which he could potentially get if the board believed the delay was caused by an unreasonable seller and not by his own maneuvering." "Yes." "Which is why he needed you to be the one talking to Evelyn. If you'd succeeded in bringing her to the table quickly, the delay would have appeared resolved through normal negotiation. The clause question might never have come up." He stopped. "And if you became a problem instead of a solution, the custody filing discredits me. I become the story instead of the timeline." She stood up from the table. "He's been playing a completely different game than anyone thought. This was never about the development." She heard him breathe. Then, "I need to make some calls."
Make them fast. We have 3 hours before the board meeting, and Vaughn is going to know by morning that the audit ran. If he figures out we found the clause before 6 a.m., he'll file a preemptive motion with the board to reframe everything. I know. A pause. Nora. What? I'm sorry, he said, for not seeing what Hale was doing, for not protecting you from being put in this position.
She stood at Evelyn's kitchen window with the dark fig tree barely visible in the yard and let the apology land without deflecting it or minimizing it. Make the calls, she said, and hung up. She turned to find Evelyn watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on her face before, something that combined pride with something harder and sadder, the look of someone watching a person they care about do something that costs them. You should sleep, Evelyn said. I should. The guest room has 2 beds. Emma's in the small one. She went. She lay down in the dark in the larger bed and listened to Emma breathe across the room, and she didn't sleep, but she rested, which was the closest available thing, and at 5 a.m. her alarm went off and she got up and dressed in the dark and bent over Emma and kissed her forehead without waking her. Evelyn was already in the kitchen. She had coffee ready and toast on the table and her handbag on the chair beside her, dressed in the kind of quiet authority that doesn't require announcement. You're coming, Nora said. Yes. I didn't ask you to come until after. I know. Evelyn picked up her coffee. I'm not waiting for after. The Vale Meridian offices occupied floors 12 through 15 of a glass tower in the financial district. At 5:58 a.m., the lobby was empty except for a security guard and a cleaning crew finishing the overnight shift, and the elevator Nora and Evelyn rode to the 14th floor was mirrored on 3 sides and made Nora aware of exactly how she looked. A woman who hadn't slept in 22 hours in yesterday's clothes with a legal pad under her arm and 48 hours of accumulated pressure sitting somewhere behind her eyes. She looked at herself and looked away. The conference room was already occupied when they arrived. Adrian was at the head of the table, standing, with a laptop open and 2 other people she didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up and a man about the same age with a legal pad of his own. His attorneys, she assumed. 2 board members had arrived early, both men, both older, both doing the thing where they looked at Nora and Evelyn and then at Adrian with a question in their expressions they hadn't yet formed into words. By 6:10, 6 of the 9 board members were seated, then 7, then 8. Sterling Vaughn walked in at 6:14. She had not seen him in person before. She'd built him from a voice and a set of documents and the shape of the damage he'd caused, and the in-person version was smaller. Not physically, he was not a small man, but there was something about him that contracted when she looked at him directly. He wore the suit of a man who needed other people to feel it. He came into the room, and his eyes moved immediately to her, and she watched the exact moment he registered that she knew, the slight tightening at the corner of his right eye, the almost imperceptible reset of his jaw. He looked at Evelyn. Then he sat down. Clifton Reese came in 30 seconds behind him, took the seat beside him, and did not look at anyone. 9 board members. Adrian at the head, his 2 attorneys at the side. Nora and Evelyn seated against the wall, which was where Adrian had put them, not at the table, which had been Nora's choice. She didn't want to be at the table yet. Adrian called the meeting to order. He was different in this room than he'd been in the diner, in the parking lot, on the phone at 2 a.m. Not colder, more precise. He presented the audit findings without preamble, without softening, moving through the Hale communications and the Vaughn meetings and the parallel pressure strategy with the efficiency of someone who'd been awake all night organizing exactly this. He put documents on the screen. He cited dates. He was 3 minutes into it when Vaughn said, "This is an internal HR matter being dramatized for Sterling." Adrian didn't raise his voice. "You'll have time to respond." Vaughn's mouth closed. Adrian continued. He reached the custody filing. He put the date on the screen. Yesterday, 4:57 p.m. He put beside it the name of the junior associate who filed it and the associate's previous employment at Vaughn Capital. He let the board look at that for 5 full seconds before he moved on. Then he put Clause 7C on the screen. He put the timeline beside it. He put the date of the first formal approach to Evelyn, January 14th, beside both of them, and he let the math exist in the room without explaining it because it didn't need explaining. It was arithmetic. It was 18 weeks and 60 days, and 11 weeks past a contingency window, and every person in that room who'd been in business longer than 10 years understood immediately what they were looking at. The silence was the loudest thing she'd heard in days. "You lost the carried interest in week 11, Adrian said. He was looking directly at Vaughn. Every action taken through Marcus Hale, every communication, every piece of external pressure applied to Ms. Whitmore and Ms. Brooks was not in service of completing this development. It was in service of preventing this board from examining that timeline." He paused. "You've been using Vale Meridian's operational infrastructure to cover up the loss of your own financial position. That's not an investment dispute. That's fraud." The word landed in the room and didn't leave. Vaughn leaned forward. His voice was controlled. She'd give him that. His voice was very controlled. "What you're presenting as fraud is a timeline dispute subject to interpretation under the contingency language. My legal team has already prepared a counter-reading of Clause 7C that establishes the 60-day window as Sterling." This time it wasn't Adrian who spoke. It was the woman with the reading glasses. She'd been still and silent through the entire presentation, and now she was looking at Vaughn with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. Her name, Nora would learn later, was Patricia Osei, and she'd been on the Vale Meridian board for 11 years. "We've been looking at this timeline for the last 4 minutes, and I don't see any interpretation that changes the arithmetic. January to May is not 60 days by any standard." Vaughn looked at her. Something shifted in his face, the first real crack. "Patricia, don't," she said simply. Reese had not spoken. Nora watched him. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has just realized the ship he's standing on is going down and is calculating how far the shore is. Adrian looked at Nora. She stood up. She hadn't prepared a speech. She'd thought about preparing one somewhere around 3 a.m. at Evelyn's kitchen table, and had decided against it because speeches were for people who needed to convince themselves as much as their audience. And she was past that point. She stood and she looked at the board. All 9 of them, moving her eyes from face to face the way she'd learned to read a room over a decade of carrying plates and managing the specific human weather of a diner. And she said, "My name is Nora Whitmore. I was hired by Adrian Vale 12 days ago to build a bridge between this company and Evelyn Brooks. What I actually became was a pressure instrument in a plan I wasn't shown." She held the legal pad against her side. "I'm not going to tell you what to do about Sterling Vaughn. You have attorneys for that, and frankly better information than I do about what the legal exposure looks like." She paused. "What I'm going to tell you is about the building you're trying to develop." She put the legal pad on the table and pushed it toward the center. Evelyn Brooks opened that diner in 1986. She was 33 years old, and she had $200 and a commercial lease she couldn't quite afford. She ran it for 38 years. She looked at Evelyn against the wall, who was sitting with her hands in her lap and her face still, and her eyes on Nora with full attention. "When I was 17 years old, I was 2 months out of foster care. I had $70 and no address, and I walked into that diner because it had a help wanted sign in the window. Evelyn Brooks looked at me for about 30 seconds and hired me and sent me to the back to eat something before I started my shift." She paused. "That's not a story about charity. That's a story about what that building actually is. It's a decision-making infrastructure. It's a place where someone in a position of power looked at someone who had nothing and chose to invest instead of dismiss." The room was very quiet. "You want to put a tower there," she said. "I'm not here to tell you that's wrong. Development happens. Neighborhoods change. That's not the argument." She looked at Patricia Osei, then at the others. "The argument is that you had a chance to build something that honored what was already there. Not just a name in a lobby, but the actual function of the place, the actual reason it mattered. And instead of pursuing that chance, someone in this room spent 4 months building a covert operation to force an old woman out before anyone could count to 60. She let that sit. "The question in front of you right now is not just what to do about Sterling Vaughn. It's what kind of company you want to be when the lawyers are done with that part of it." She sat down. The room held its silence for a moment that had actual weight to it. Then Evelyn stood up. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't have notes. She stood up from her chair against the wall, and she looked at the board the way she looked at everything, directly, without ceremony, with the full authority of someone who'd been in rooms where people tried to diminish her for 4 decades and had never once let it take. "I'm not going to tell you my story again," she said. "Nora told it, and she told it accurately." She paused. "What I'll tell you is what I need, not what I want, what I need. Because I think the reason this has been so difficult is that nobody in this process has asked me that question directly and waited for the actual answer." She laid it out. The same thing she'd told Nora at her kitchen table, but in this room, at this table, with these 9 people. And it landed differently because she was here to receive it rather than Nora carrying it secondhand. The diner in perpetuity, the community infrastructure, real housing, real kitchen programming, real investment in the neighborhood instead of a name on glass. When she finished, Patricia Osei said, "Is there a development structure that accommodates what Ms. Brooks is describing and still produces viable returns on the primary tower?" Adrian's attorney answered. "Yes," she said. "It reduced yield by approximately 12% on the primary instrument, but remained well above the threshold returns for the development's original financing." Patricia looked at Adrian. "And you're prepared to pursue that structure?" "Yes," Adrian said. She looked at Vaughn. Vaughn was looking at the table. "I'd like to call for a procedural vote," Patricia said, "to suspend Sterling Vaughn's board participation pending an independent review of the conduct described in this presentation." She looked around the table. "All in favor?" 7 hands. Reese did not raise his hand, but he did not speak either. He sat with his hand flat on the table and looked at the wall and was very still, the stillness of a man deciding what kind of person he's going to be in the next 10 seconds, and then his hand came up. Slowly. All the way. 8. Vaughn stood up. He stood up fast enough that his chair moved back and hit the one behind it. His face had finally done what faces do under terminal pressure. Shed the performance layer and gone to something rawer underneath. Not grief, not quite rage, more like the expression of a man watching the structure he built come off its foundation. "You don't have the votes to remove me from the carried interest position," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him that. "Whatever you vote here today, the financing instrument is a separate legal agreement. My attorneys will—" "Sterling," Patricia again. Same flat tone. "The carried interest is void by its own terms. You know that. Your attorneys know that. The only question now is whether you want to add a protracted legal dispute to your existing exposure." She looked at him without any visible emotion. "I'd encourage you to talk to your lawyers before you finish that sentence." Vaughn looked at her. He looked at Adrian. He looked, finally, at Nora. And it was the look of a man identifying the precise point where his plan had failed him, locating it in a specific person, and finding that person looking back at him without flinching. He picked up his phone and his notepad from the table and he walked out. Reese followed 30 seconds later, quietly, without looking at anyone. The door closed. The room let out a collective breath that wasn't quite audible but was present. The physical pressure change of a held thing released. Someone poured water. Someone else opened a laptop. Patricia Osei leaned forward and said to Adrian, "I want independent counsel brought in on the Hale conduct review. Today." And Adrian said, "Already arranged," and the meeting shifted into its next register, the slower administrative aftermath of a confrontation that had resolved in one direction. Nora was looking at her phone. There was a voicemail from her attorney. Timestamped 6:41 a.m., 18 minutes ago, while she'd been in this room. She stepped out into the hallway and listened to it standing against the wall with the hum of the building's ventilation system around her and the glass city visible through the window at the end of the corridor. Her attorney's voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone delivering information they verified before calling. The emergency custody motion had been filed by a party with no standing to file it. The junior associate was not on record as counsel in the Whitmore custody case and had filed under an incorrectly formatted emergency classification. The court clerk had flagged the procedural defect at opening of business. The motion had been administratively dismissed at 6:22 a.m. before it had ever reached a judge's desk. A procedural defect. It hadn't even made it to a judge. Vaughn had built the entire filing around a junior associate who wasn't actually authorized to file it, because he'd been moving so fast, covering his position before the board meeting, that he'd made a basic procedural error. She lowered the phone. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and took one long, slow breath that started somewhere deep and moved through everything on its way out. The motion was dismissed. Emma was still hers. The board had suspended Vaughn. The clause was void by its own terms. She stood in the hallway and felt all of it. Not euphoria, nothing as light as that. More like the feeling of a structure that's been under sustained lateral pressure finally finding its vertical again. The relief of something that has not fallen. She was still standing there when the conference room door opened and Evelyn came out into the hallway and looked at her. "Well," Evelyn said. "The custody motion was dismissed," Nora said. "Procedural defect." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she made a sound that started as a breath and became something between a laugh and something else entirely. The sound of a woman who has held herself together through considerable force of will and is briefly allowing something to move through her. "Come here," she said. Nora went. Evelyn put both arms around her and held her the way she had at 17. Not soft, not tentative, with the full weight of herself, the embrace of someone who means it entirely. And Nora put her head against Evelyn's shoulder, and for 30 seconds she let herself be held and didn't manage any of it. Then she straightened. She pressed her fingers against her eyes once. She breathed. "We're not done," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed, "but we're past the worst of it." "Are we?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Sterling Vaughn is going to get up tomorrow morning and he's going to still be Sterling Vaughn. He's going to have lawyers, and he's going to have money, and he's going to have the particular kind of tenacity that belongs to people who've never really lost before." She paused. "But he's going to be doing all of that without a board position, and without a carried interest, and without Marcus Hale." She tilted her head slightly. "And we're going to be doing what we're doing with Adrian Vale's full institutional support, with independent counsel overseeing the process, and with a community benefit agreement that I intend to be written so tightly that it outlasts everyone in that room." Nora looked at her. "You've already thought about the agreement language." "I've been thinking about it for 4 months," Evelyn said. "I had a lot of time while people were calling me unreasonable." Through the conference room window behind Evelyn's shoulder, Nora could see Adrian Vale standing at the head of the table with his attorneys, the remaining board members around him, the city visible behind the glass in the early morning light. All of it in motion, all of it still unresolved in its particulars, still requiring the slow, careful work of turning a confrontation into an agreement and an agreement into something that would hold. Her phone buzzed. Emma. Not Emma, the Delaney Street number. She answered it. "Mama?" Emma's voice still sleep rough, slightly confused by the unfamiliar room. "Where are you?" "I'm at a meeting, baby. I'll be back soon." "Gerald wants breakfast." "Tell Gerald I'll be there in an hour." She paused. "Is Evelyn's house okay?" A moment of consideration. "It smells like soup," Emma said, which was a complete evaluation, and apparently a positive one, because she said, "Okay, 1 hour," with the authority of someone setting a deadline, and hung up. Evelyn was watching her with the expression she'd worn on and off since the night before, the one that was pride and something harder and sadder, and something else that Nora was only now beginning to read accurately. Not pity, not relief, something closer to recognition, the look of someone watching a person arrive at the version of themselves they were always going to be, and being glad they're still around to see it. Adrian came out of the conference room. He looked at both of them. He looked tired in a way that was honest, not performed exhaustion, the actual texture of a man who'd spent a night doing something that cost him. "The board wants to schedule a formal meeting with you," he said to Evelyn, "to discuss the community benefit agreement directly. No legal team intermediaries, you and the board, with independent counsel present for both sides." Evelyn said, "When?" "As soon as you're ready." She considered it for exactly as long as she needed to. "Next week," she said. "Tuesday. My house. They can come to me." Something crossed Adrian's face, not surprise exactly. More like the specific expression of a person encountering a standard they hadn't considered but immediately understood was correct. "I'll arrange it," he said. Nora looked at him. He looked at her. There was something in the space between them that hadn't been there 12 days ago when he'd sat down at her counter and ordered chicken and waffles, something that had been built entirely out of 2 in the morning phone calls and financing documents and the specific pressure of a situation that had tried its absolute hardest to break both of them. "Your car," he said. "The one that was repossessed, the day at the courthouse." She blinked. "What about it?" "I want to replace it." He held up a hand before she could speak, not as a gesture, not as something that creates an obligation, as a correction of a material circumstance that was used against you and Emma as part of a strategy designed to limit your options. He paused. "It's a separate matter from the contract, and I'd like to handle it separately if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once. He seemed to understand that this was as close to yes as she was going to get today, which was exactly right, and the fact that he understood it was a small piece of data she filed away without letting herself make too much of it yet. "There's one more thing," he said. He was looking at something on his phone. "Vaughn's attorney contacted my general counsel at 6:58 this morning. They're requesting a private meeting before any formal legal process begins." He looked up. "He's going to try to negotiate." Nora looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Nora. "Let him," Evelyn said. "Let him come to the table, and when he does—" She picked up her handbag from the chair where she'd set it. "Make sure he understands what it costs to walk away from a table that someone built with their own hands." She walked to the elevator. Nora fell into step beside her. The elevator doors opened and they stepped in, and the mirrored walls showed them back to themselves. An old woman with white hair and a straight spine and 40 years of something real behind her eyes, and a younger woman standing next to her with yesterday's clothes and a legal pad, and the particular expression of someone who has just come through something and not yet fully registered that they've come through it. The doors closed. "Evelyn," Nora said. "When Vaughn comes to the table," she looked at their reflections. "I want to be in the room." Evelyn looked at her in the mirror. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm going to make sure you are." The elevator descended. The city rose up around the glass on all sides, bright and indifferent and full of the kind of morning that doesn't know what you've just been through and doesn't need to, because the morning doesn't owe you anything and never did, and you showed up anyway. Sterling Vaughn's attorney called on a Wednesday. Not Monday, not Tuesday. Wednesday, which Nora had come to understand was deliberate. 2 days of silence after the board meeting. 2 days in which Vaughn's legal team had presumably run every number, read every clause, examined every angle of the exposed timeline, and arrived at the same arithmetic the rest of them had arrived at in Evelyn's kitchen at 2 in the morning. The call came at 9:43 a.m., professionally timed, the hour of a person who wants to project that they've spent the morning on other things. The attorney's name was Diane Forsyth. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has spent a career delivering bad news on behalf of people who didn't want to deliver it themselves. Controlled, precise, not unkind, but not warm either. She requested a meeting. She said her client was prepared to discuss a resolution. She used the word resolution 3 times in 90 seconds, which told Nora everything she needed to know about how Vaughn's team had assessed the situation. Nora was in the motel room when the call came in. She'd moved back 2 days ago. Evelyn had offered the guest room indefinitely, and she'd declined because there was a version of accepting help that was necessary and a version that became something you built your dependency on, and she was precise about knowing the difference. Emma was at the table doing her puzzle, the same forest scene, nearly complete now. A few blue sky pieces left in the upper corner. "Thursday," Nora said. 2 p.m., Evelyn Brooks's house on Delaney Street. A pause. "My client was expecting a neutral location." "Miss Brooks's home is the location," Nora said. "If that's not acceptable, we can schedule a formal legal proceeding instead." She paused. "I imagine your client has an opinion about which he prefers." Another pause. Longer. "Thursday at 2, Forsyth said, and ended the call. Nora set the phone down and looked at the puzzle. Emma had found one of the blue pieces and was testing it against the corner with the patient empirical focus of someone who understood that you had to try the wrong fit before you could recognize the right one. She called Evelyn. "Thursday," she said. 2 p.m. Your house. A beat. "Good," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee. He doesn't deserve coffee, but I'm not going to sit across a table from a man without something in my hands. I'll be there by 1.
Bring Emma. She can be in the garden. She called Adrian last. He was in a meeting. She got his assistant, left a message, and he called back within 7 minutes, which she noted without assigning it more meaning than it had. He was prompt. That was a data point, not a declaration. Thursday, 2 p.m., she said. Evelyn's house. Vaughn's attorney will be present. I want your general counsel there, but not leading. Evelyn and I lead. A beat. Understood. And I want the independent counsel who's reviewing the Hale situation present as an observer, not participating, present. I can arrange that. One more thing. She looked out the window at the parking lot. Has Marcus Hale been formally removed from the project? Terminated, Adrian said. Monday morning. We're in the process of assessing what information he may have shared with Vaughn beyond what the audit captured. Has he been cooperative? A pause that told her the answer before he spoke. No. Then assume Vaughn knows more than we think he knows. She picked up the pen from the table and turned it in her fingers. He's going to come to that table Thursday with something.
He's not the kind of man who comes to a meeting like this without a countermove prepared. Whatever it is, we need to not be surprised by it. What do you think it is? She'd been thinking about that since the board meeting. She'd been thinking about the shape of Vaughn as she'd come to understand him. The patience, the infrastructure, the willingness to build a plan over months and operate it through intermediaries. Men like that didn't capitulate at the first structural failure. They recalibrated. He's going to try to reframe the timeline, she said. He's going to argue that the 60-day contingency was told, suspended, by what he'll characterize as bad faith negotiation on Evelyn's part. If he can establish that argument, even partially, it reopens the carried interest question. She paused. It won't work legally. But he doesn't need it to work legally. He needs it to create enough ambiguity that a settlement becomes more attractive to your board than a prolonged dispute. Silence on the line. Then, how do you know that? Because that's what I would do, she said. If I were him, and I needed to change the outcome of a meeting I'd already lost. She heard him breathe. I'll have our counsel prepare for that argument. Good. She set the pen down. See you Thursday. Thursday arrived the way consequential days do, without announcement, identical in its weather and light to the days before it, indifferent to what it was carrying. The Phoenix heat was marginally less savage than it had been, which in August meant 99 degrees instead of 107, a distinction that mattered only in contrast to what had come before. Nora arrived at Delaney Street at 1:03. Emma went immediately to the garden where Evelyn had set up a small table with paper and crayons under the fig tree. Nora watched her go and felt the specific relief of a child who doesn't know what's about to happen in the house behind her and doesn't need to. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She had coffee made and a plate of something on the counter, and the particular stillness of a person who has been preparing herself for something for a long time and has arrived at the place past preparation. How do you feel? Nora asked. Old, Evelyn said, and not in the way that means tired, in the way that means I've seen enough to know exactly what this is. She poured 2 cups. Vaughn is going to sit at my table, and he's going to try to make me feel like I'm unreasonable for not accepting what he's offering, because that's been the play from the beginning. She set the cups down. I've been called unreasonable by better people than Sterling Vaughn. I've had practice. Adrian arrived at 1:30 with his general counsel, a woman named Sylvia Park, compact and precise, and carrying a leather folder that looked like it had been used in serious rooms before, and the independent counsel, a man named Okafor, who said almost nothing but had the quality of someone who misses nothing either. They arranged themselves in Evelyn's living room. Evelyn's house was not a conference room and made no attempt to be one. The furniture was real and lived in, the bookshelves full to their edges, the afternoon light coming through the front window in a way that hit the table at an angle that would make anyone sitting across from it have to adjust their eyes. Nora had noticed this when she chose the seating arrangement and had chosen it deliberately. Vaughn arrived at 2 p.m. exactly. He came with Forsyth and one other attorney whose name Nora didn't catch. He was dressed exactly as she would have predicted. Not aggressively, not in the power suit register of a man trying to dominate the room, but in the quieter, more deliberate clothing of someone who wanted to project reasonableness. He had done something to his face between the board meeting and today, some act of will or preparation, because the crack she'd seen in him Thursday morning was not visible now. He came into the room and he looked at Evelyn's house. Really looked, taking it in. And something crossed his face that she couldn't immediately name. He sat down. Forsyth sat beside him. The other attorney opened a laptop. Evelyn sat across from him. She had her coffee and she had her hands in her lap, and she was looking at him the way she looked at everything. Without performance, without hostility, with the direct attention of someone who has decided to see a thing accurately and does not need it to be other than it is. Vaughn looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Ms. Brooks, I owe you an apology." The room adjusted. Nora kept her face still. She had prepared for the timeline argument, for the toll argument, for various legal reframings. She had not prepared for an apology, which was either genuine or the most sophisticated opening she'd encountered, and she had about 4 seconds to figure out which. Evelyn said nothing. She waited. "The approach taken to your property over the last several months was wrong," Vaughn said. His voice was level, not performatively contrite. "Not just strategically. Wrong. The people who were supposed to represent my interests used methods I wouldn't have sanctioned if I'd been fully informed of them." He paused. "I was not fully informed." "By Marcus Hale," Nora said. He looked at her. "Among others." A pause. "Ms. Whitmore, what was done regarding your custody matter was done without my knowledge or authorization. I want to state that directly and on the record." "For the record," Okafor said quietly from his chair by the window, "this conversation is being documented by both parties' counsel." "I'm aware," Vaughn said. He looked back at Evelyn. "My interest in this development has been significant. I won't pretend otherwise, but there is a substantial difference between aggressive deal-making and what was actually executed here, and I am not going to sit in your house and pretend that line wasn't crossed." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you here, Mr. Vaughn?" He looked slightly caught by the directness of it. "To reach a resolution?" "I know what your attorney said on the phone," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you why you're here, in my house, in person." She waited. "Because you could have sent Forsyth alone. Men like you usually do when there's a settlement to negotiate. They send the lawyer and they wait for the number to come back." She tilted her head very slightly. "So why are you here?" Something moved through Vaughn's face. He was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, not performing consideration. "My mother ran a diner," he said, "in Scranton for 22 years. He looked down at the table briefly and then back up. "She sold it. When the neighborhood changed, she was offered money and she took it, and she regretted it until she died." He paused. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I've been in this process for 4 months, and I've been looking at your property as a number, and it took sitting in a boardroom listening to a woman I've never met describe what your diner actually is." He stopped. He looked at Nora. "To understand what my executives meant when they said you were being unreasonable." The room was very quiet. "They meant," he said, "that you knew what it was worth. And they didn't." Evelyn studied him. The study was thorough and unhurried, and she did not offer him anything from it until she was finished. "That's a very good speech," she said finally. He almost smiled. "I know. I'm going to need more than a speech." "I know that too." He opened the folder in front of him. "What I'm prepared to offer is the following. Full concession on the Brooks property. Deed restriction in perpetuity, no development, no acquisition. The community benefit structure Ms. Brooks described to the board, funded at twice the originally proposed level, with independent trustees and an enforcement mechanism that doesn't depend on Vale Meridian's ongoing participation." He paused. "And a formal letter of withdrawal from any involvement in the Whitmore custody proceedings, submitted to the court and to Miss Whitmore's attorney today." Nora looked at the folder. She looked at Adrian, who was looking at the folder with the expression of someone reading something for the second time after having read it once in private. "You've already discussed this structure with Vale's counsel," she said. Vaughn looked at her. "Yes." "When?" "Yesterday morning." She looked at Adrian. He met her eyes. He called me Wednesday evening, Adrian said. After you and I spoke. I should have told you. I'm telling you now.
She held his gaze for a moment. The specific quality of what she felt about that, the fracture of it, the fact that it wasn't a betrayal but was adjacent to one. She put it in a box and set the box on a shelf and did not open it in front of this room, because this room was not the place for it. "What does Vale Meridian's concession look like?" she said to Adrian, keeping her voice even. "We absorb the full cost of the community benefit structure. The development proceeds on the remaining block with the modified yield, which the board approved this morning." He paused. "And I'm personally guaranteeing the deed restriction enforcement, not the company, me, in writing." She thought about that. She turned it over and looked at its underside. "What does Vaughn get?" she said. Forsyth said, "My client's cooperation with the independent investigation in exchange for the board's agreement not to pursue civil litigation on the carried interest question. The interest is void. That's agreed. In exchange for cooperation, no civil suit." Nora looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at the table. She was turning her coffee cup slowly between her palms, the same gesture she'd made in the kitchen the first night, reading the financing documents. She was thinking, and she was doing it without apology or performance, taking the time it required. "The independent trustees for the community fund," she said. "I choose 2 of the 5. Forsyth looked at Vaughn. He nodded. "The enforcement mechanism for the deed restriction," Evelyn said. "I want it triggered not just by construction or development, by any change of use. If that building becomes anything other than what it is, the restriction activates." Adrian's counsel made a note. "And the letter to the court regarding Miss Whitmore's custody matter," Evelyn said. She looked at Vaughn directly. "I want to read it before it's filed." Vaughn looked at her. "You want to read my attorney's letter?" "I want to know what you're actually saying," Evelyn said. "Because a letter that says we had no involvement is different from a letter that says we actively introduced false information into a legal proceeding, and I want to know which one it is before we agree to anything." The room was very still. Vaughn looked at Evelyn for a long moment. Something in his face had the quality of a man being seen in a way he hadn't anticipated and finding it less intolerable than he'd expected. "Forsyth," he said quietly. Forsyth opened a document on the laptop and turned it to face Evelyn. Evelyn read it. She took her time. No one spoke. The afternoon light moved on the table. From the garden, faint and distant, they could hear Emma talking to Gerald about something with great seriousness. Evelyn looked up. She looked at Nora. Nora leaned across and read the letter. It was 3 paragraphs. The second paragraph used the words actively provided and materially false. It named the junior associate. It named Vaughn Capital as the source of the instruction. It did not equivocate. She sat back. She looked at Vaughn. He was watching her with the particular expression of a man waiting for a verdict and not pretending otherwise. "Why?" she said. "You didn't have to go this far. You could have written the other letter and we'd have had a harder time proving the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm 63 years old," he said, "and my mother sold her diner. And I've spent 40 years building things on top of things that were already built by someone else. And I told myself that was just how development works." He paused. It took sitting in a boardroom and watching the arithmetic of what I'd actually done get laid out on a screen in front of 9 people who knew me to understand that I'd stopped being able to tell the difference between aggressive and wrong a long time ago. He looked at the table. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking you to let me do something that's actually correct while I still can." The room held that. Evelyn set down her coffee cup. She looked at Nora. Nora looked back at her and gave her nothing. Because this was Evelyn's to decide and always had been, and Nora's job right now was to make sure no one else's weight was in the room. Evelyn looked at Vaughn. "I accept," she said, "on the conditions as stated." The paperwork took 2 hours. Sylvia Park and Forsyth sat at the kitchen table and worked through the language while Okafor observed, and Adrian stood in the hallway making calls, and Nora sat on the porch steps and watched Emma in the garden. Emma had abandoned the crayons and was now attempting to teach Gerald to identify plants by touching their leaves, describing each one with the focused pedagogy of a child who has decided that stuffed animals deserve education. Samuel Mercer arrived at 4:15. He knocked on the garden gate rather than the front door, which was how Nora knew Evelyn had called him, and he came through the garden with his color fully restored and his posture better than it had been on the courthouse gravel, and an expression that was trying very hard not to be pleased with itself. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He
was looking at her with the warmth of someone who had been told a story about what she'd done and had been wanting to tell her something about it since. "Samuel." She stood from the steps. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I deserve," he said, "given that I apparently tried to die in a parking lot." He came and sat beside where she'd been on the steps, settling carefully. "Adrian called me this morning, told me what happened. Most of it was enough." He was quiet for a moment, watching Emma in the garden. "She's yours." "Yes." "She looks like you. She has better judgment than me. She was born with it." He almost laughed. "Adrian also told me he offered to replace your car." "He did." "And you said you'd think about it." "I did." He was quiet. "You know, I've known Adrian Vale since he was 11 years old. His parents died when he was 15, and I stepped in where I could, which was not always enough and not always right." He folded his hands on his knees. "He's made a great deal of money, and he's been careful with most of it, and careless with some of it, the way people are. He's built things that mattered and things that didn't." He paused. What he did in that boardroom, walking into a structured presentation that could have cost him operational control of the biggest development his company has run, he didn't do that for the business. Nora looked at him. "I'm not telling you what to do with that information," Samuel said. "I'm just telling you what it is." She looked back at the garden. Emma had found a caterpillar and was introducing it to Gerald with the gravity of a formal occasion. "He kept things from me," she said. "The Wednesday call with Vaughn. He did." "That's the kind of thing that compounds." "It can," Samuel said. "Or it's the kind of thing that, when it happens once and is owned honestly and doesn't happen again, becomes part of the foundation instead of a crack in it." He paused. "Depends entirely on what both people do with it." She sat with that. The paperwork was signed at 6:12 p.m. Forsyth filed the letter to the court electronically at 6:27. Nora's attorney called at 6:41 to confirm receipt and to tell her, in the careful voice of someone who has seen a lot of custody cases and knows better than to celebrate prematurely, that the filing materially changed the landscape of the modification motion and that Trevor's legal team had already requested a continuance, which in her opinion was the first gesture of a side that was reassessing its position. Nora listened to all of it standing on Evelyn's porch in the cooling evening air, with the city's lights beginning to come up in the middle distance, and Emma asleep in the garden chair with Gerald on her chest, having worn herself completely out in the business of education. She thanked her attorney and ended the call, and stood there for a while with the phone against her sternum and the evening around her and the specific quality of a silence that is not empty but full of the weight of what has just concluded and the shape of what comes after, which is not nothing, which is actually everything, but which is quieter and slower and requires a different kind of attention than crisis does. Evelyn came out and stood beside her. They looked at the city together without speaking for a while, the way people do who have been through something together and are in the part that comes after the through. "What happens to the diner now?" Nora said. "It stays," Evelyn said. "Which is what it was always going to do." She paused. "I want to bring someone in to help manage it. I'm not going to pretend I'm not 71 years old. I need someone who knows what it is and knows how to keep it being what it is." She didn't look at Nora. "I was thinking of someone who's been doing it for 10 years already, just in someone else's establishment." Nora looked at the city. "I can't take a charity position," she said. "It's not charity. It's a salary with a profit-sharing structure and a lease on the apartment above the diner at below market rate, because the apartment belongs to the building, and the building now belongs to itself in perpetuity, and the rate is whatever I say it is." Evelyn paused. "You'd be in a permanent address by the end of the month." Emma's custody hearing, the 30-day deadline, the proof of stable housing. She turned and looked at Evelyn, who was looking back at her with the same expression she'd worn in the doorway of the diner when Nora was 17. That frank, unhurried assessment that saw exactly what was there and chose to invest in it anyway. Not because it was easy, because it was right. I need to think about it, Nora said. You need to stop saying that, Evelyn said, to every good thing that comes toward you. She said it without sharpness. It landed the way true things land, not as a blow, but as a weight settling into place. Nora looked at her hands. She looked at Emma in the garden chair with the caterpillar probably long gone and Gerald still faithfully in position. She thought about the motel room and the notepad and the list she'd made with $11 in her pocket and one thing at a time taped to the bathroom mirror and then taken down because she'd moved past what it was for.
Okay, she said. Okay, you'll think about it? Or okay, yes? Okay, yes. Evelyn nodded once. Good. She went back inside. Nora stood on the porch for another minute. Then she went into the garden and sat in the chair beside Emma and put her hand lightly on her daughter's knee without waking her and looked at the fig tree in the last of the evening light, dark and heavy with late summer weight, the kind of tree that has been somewhere long enough to have opinions about itself. She heard the front door open and close, footsteps on the porch. She didn't turn around. Adrian came through the garden gate. He stopped a few feet away when he saw Emma asleep and adjusted his approach accordingly. Quieter, careful, the specific consideration of a person recalibrating to a room's actual contents. He came and sat on the garden bench across from her. He didn't speak. She appreciated that. They sat like that for a while in the cooling evening, the city sounds low and distant, Emma's breathing even and slow between them. You should have told me about the Wednesday call, she said. Not hard, just said. Yes, he said. I should have. If this is going to be... She stopped. She started again. If there's going to be anything between us that's real, I need to know things when they happen. Not managed, not sequenced, when they happen. He was quiet for a moment. That's a fair requirement. It's not a requirement, she said. It's just what I need. She looked at him. There's a difference. He looked back at her. The evening was doing something to the light in the garden. That specific hour when everything softens without losing its shape. When the day hasn't quite ended and the night hasn't quite started and the space between them is briefly its own thing. I know the difference, he said. She believed him. That surprised her a little. Not that he'd said it, but that she believed it. She filed that away. I'm taking the position with Evelyn, she said. The diner. The apartment. He nodded. He didn't perform anything about it. Not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, clean and present. I'm going to be busy for a long time, she said. The custody hearing, the new position, getting Emma settled in the apartment, the community benefit structure, getting stood up. I'm going to be in a sustained period of not having room for complications. Okay, he said. That's not me telling you to go away. I know. That's me telling you what I have room for, so you're not surprised by it. She looked at Emma. I don't move fast. Not anymore. Neither do I, he said, when it matters. She looked at him again. He was not performing patience. She'd seen perform patience. She knew its texture, the slightly staged quality of it, the way it asks to be noticed. This was just stillness, the actual kind. My car, she said. Something shifted in his expression, careful, not sure where this was going. I'll let you replace it, she said. Not as a gift, as a loan. I'll pay it back out of the salary, at a rate we agree on, with terms in writing. She paused. Because I'm not interested in owing you things I didn't agree to owe you, but I'm also done refusing useful things out of pride when Emma needs a car seat in a reliable vehicle. He looked at her for a long moment. Deal, he said. Good. They were quiet again. Emma moved slightly in the chair, resettling, and Gerald slid 6 inches, and Nora caught him without looking and set him back on her chest, a motion so automatic it didn't register as effort. Across the garden, the fig tree moved in a small breeze that came and went. The city was fully in its evening mode now, the lights constant and the sounds low, and everything that had happened in the last 3 weeks sitting somewhere in her body in the way that things sit when they've been fully arrived at. Not resolved in the sense of gone, but resolved in the sense of placed, given their location, allowed to be what they are. She had a custody hearing in 11 days. She had a job and an apartment,
and the specific responsibility of helping steward a place that had sheltered her when she had nothing to offer in exchange. She had a daughter who was teaching stuffed animals botany in a garden on Delaney Street. She had a man sitting 6 feet away on a garden bench who had cost her sleep and caused her real trouble, and also, at the precise moment it mattered most, chosen correctly. She didn't know what any of that would look like in a year. She'd stopped pretending she could know that. What she knew was today, and today was a lot. More than she'd had in a long time. More than $11 and a manila folder and 6 blocks of Phoenix heat that she'd walked through without letting Emma see her face. "Evelyn wants me to come for dinner next week," Adrian said. "Tuesday." "The board meeting is Tuesday." "After the board meeting." "That's ambitious." "That's Evelyn." She almost smiled. "Yes, it is." Emma stirred. She came up from sleep the way she always did. Not gradually, but all at once, eyes open, present, looking at Nora with the immediate recognition of a child who checks first for her mother before anything else. "Mama." "Hey, baby." Emma looked at Adrian with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise evaluation as politeness. "You're the helicopter man," she said. Adrian looked at her. "I am." "The blades are very loud." "They are," he agreed. "I apologize for the papers." Emma considered this. "Mama fixed it," she said, which was her complete analysis of the situation, accurate and sufficient, and she slid off the chair and picked up Gerald and came to Nora and leaned against her side in the way she did when she was done with the day and ready for what came next. Nora put her arm around her. They stayed in the garden until the evening had fully settled into dark, the 3 of them and the fig tree and Gerald and the city lights coming up full and steady over the rooftops of a neighborhood that was still, for now, itself. 4 weeks later, Nora Whitmore signed a lease. It was a standard residential lease for the apartment above Evelyn's diner on a street in a Phoenix neighborhood that had been called unremarkable by people who hadn't spent any time in it, which was its own kind of description. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and a window in the kitchen that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made the room briefly golden before the day caught up to itself. Emma chose the smaller bedroom because it had a window seat and said the window seat was for Gerald. The custody hearing was on a Thursday. Nora's attorney presented the modified evidence, the letter, the stable housing, the employment documentation, the testimony provided in writing by Evelyn Brooks and Samuel Mercer, and 6 regulars from the diner who had known Nora for years in the way that people know someone who has brought them coffee through the hard mornings and the ordinary ones alike. Trevor's modification motion was denied. The visitation schedule remained as originally set. The judge noted, without elaboration, that the new evidence substantially altered the character of the original filing. Trevor's attorney did not look at Nora when they left the courtroom. Trevor did, once, briefly, in the hallway outside, and she looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a person who has stopped being afraid of him, which was not a performance and not a victory pose, just a fact, and he looked away first. She walked out of the courthouse into another August morning, the heat already building, and she didn't stand in the parking lot this time, waiting for something to be taken. She got into her car, a 4-year-old gray sedan, loan terms in writing, the payment coming out of her first 3 paychecks at a rate she'd negotiated. And she drove to the diner and parked in the spot that was hers and went inside and started the coffee maker, pressing the handle down for the full 3 seconds, and waited for the morning shift to begin. The community benefit structure was stood up in October. 2 of the 5 trustees were Evelyn's choices. The housing program broke ground in November. The kitchen training program took its first cohort in January, 12 people, 8 of whom had been living below the poverty line when they applied, learning in the same building where Evelyn had once handed a 17-year-old girl a plate of food before she'd earned a single dollar. Marcus Hale cooperated eventually. It took his own attorney explaining the exposure to him in a way that apparently translated. His cooperation confirmed what the audit had suggested and added details that made the independent counsel's report longer and more specific and useful to the people it needed to be useful to. Sterling Vaughn did not go quietly, exactly, but he went. There was a settlement that Nora was not party to and did not need to be. He divested his position in the Meridian development. He started something else, somewhere else, which was probably true to his nature and not something she spent energy on, because her energy had better places to go. The diner thrived, which is not a word that means easy. It means alive. It means the fourth Thursday of every month when the neighborhood association met at the big corner table. It means the Tuesday regulars and the Wednesday lunch crowd and the high school kids who came after 3 and stayed until 5 doing homework in the back booth. It means Evelyn at the counter on Saturday mornings, drinking her coffee and watching the room with the satisfaction of something that had endured what it needed to endure and come through it still itself. Samuel Mercer came in twice a week. He drank decaf. Nora had quietly switched him to decaf 6 weeks in, and he either hadn't noticed or had decided not to make an issue of it, which was a different kind of victory than the boardroom, but not a smaller one. Adrian came in on Thursdays. Always Thursdays, always at 7:30, always the same stool at the counter, always the coffee first and then whatever was on special, never the chicken and waffles again, which she'd asked him about once, and he'd said he didn't want to have a thing, and she'd understood that. The deliberate avoidance of a symbol that might mean more than the reality it pointed to. He was careful in that way. She was learning to trust the carefulness. They were slow, which was right. Slow in the way of things built on actual ground rather than on the urgency of crisis and proximity. Slow in the way that meant they were still there when the emergency was over. Slow in the way that turned out to be the only way either of them knew how to build anything worth keeping. One evening in late September, a Thursday, after the dinner rush had cleared and the diner was down to 2 tables and the low amber light of the end of a shift, Emma was doing homework in the corner booth where Nora could see her. Gerald was propped against the napkin dispenser. She was working on something with a pencil, her tongue at the corner of her mouth. The deep focus of a child who takes work seriously when she decides it deserves seriousness. Adrian was at the counter with his second coffee, reading something on his phone, not looking at Nora, not performing the act of being there, just there. Evelyn came through from the kitchen and stood at the end of the counter and looked at the room, at the 2 remaining tables, at Emma in the corner, at Adrian not performing anything, at Nora behind the counter with a dish towel, and the particular expression of someone who has found the center of gravity of their own life and is standing in it. She looked at all of it for a moment. Then she said to no one in particular, in the tone of someone noting a fact that has been true for a long time and is only now being said out loud, "This is what it was supposed to be." Nobody answered because it didn't require an answer. It was the kind of thing that was true on its own, that had been true since January 14th, when Evelyn had first said no to a man she'd never met. That had been true since a Thursday morning in August, when a woman walked out of a courthouse with $11 and refused to let anyone see her face fall. That had been true maybe since a girl of 17 came through a door looking for a job and someone handed her a plate of food before she'd done a single thing to earn it. Emma looked up from her homework. She looked at Evelyn, then at her mother, then at the window where the parking lot lights were coming on one by one against the early dark. "Mama," she said, "can Gerald have a hot chocolate?" "Gerald can have a hot chocolate," Nora said. She reached for the mug. She put the milk on. The diner settled into its evening quiet around her, the particular quiet of a place that has been here long enough to know what it is, and the lights were warm, and the coffee was on. And outside the city did what cities do, which is keep going, keep building, keep making the particular noise of people trying to make something from the raw material of their one life. And inside, for now, for tonight, the only sound was the milk steaming and a 6-year-old explaining to a stuffed rabbit what hot chocolate was for.